Thank you. Welcome back for the afternoon when I'm not necessarily supposed to be up here, but we still have a little bit of material, pleasure, information from the morning to catch up on because we skipped a couple of speakers who should have had the time to share their reminiscence. The first would be Shaun O'Connell from UMass Boston. I think my father's first PhD student. He always said, one of the very best, if not the best. Shaun.
I want to thank Peter and all the Chametzky family. I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity to pay homage to my undergraduate and graduate education at UMass Amherst, particularly to be in this wonderfully restored Memorial Hall, which was, I have two children who graduated from this university. Neither of them saw the inside of Memorial Hall. And I was here at the opening in 2017, but previous to that, it was 1975 when Doris Abramson was directing plays in the upstairs here, ratty, dark place. And the English department was still in the basement of this building, but you could go and ask dumb questions and get respectful answers from Sid Kaplan and Lee Varley and so many others. Jules came the year after, but then I came back to meet him. I once greeted him as Uncle Jules at a gathering at the Kaplan home after Sidney's death. No, no, Jules said, refusing the role as wise elder. I should have known better. Mentor, friend, brother, as Jeanette earlier said. That was Jules to me. But set Jules in another kind of slightly wider context that has been hinted at. First for me as an undergraduate was Sidney Kaplan, a veteran, a man passionate about social justice, about Melville, and the restoring of repressed Black voices to the American conversation. Then came Doris Abramson, a brilliant director, scholar, poet, herself a compelling, dramatic presence. She used to wear a beautiful cape as she walked around with perfect posture. She urged me to speak my lines so they could be heard in the last row of Bowker Auditorium. She'd stand at the back and say, I can't hear you. Speak up from the diaphragm. Then as a graduate student, I had the great good fortune to be in Jules's seminars. The Jew in the American Novel, the first such ever taught anywhere, and literature of the 1930s. Jules made all the difference in my life. Sid, Doris, and Jules, three Jewish professors who took a hand in educating this Irish Catholic, semi-lettered, small-town hick from a bookless home, first in his family to go to college. And I think I speak to the thousands of others that were encountered under just those circumstances. These three became my mentors, my friends, really my second family. I remember accompanying Doris to Northampton to see Invasion of the Body Snatchers at the Academy of Music. I remember Dorothy and I dropping in on a welcoming Sid and Emma. I think, dropping in? Who does that? But they were kindly and in their greetings and doted over our baby, Michael. I even remember the hot summer afternoon I helped Jules clear rodents from his North Amherst home basement. The heady gatherings at the Barrens, the spirited parties in Amherst and later at Doris and Dorothy's New Salem home, the readings. Robert Frost read here, a little over to the left. The dinners, the drinks, all the boisterous talks, I remember all of it. Once Sid and Doris improvised a sketch in the Kaplan living room. Sid slowly unscrewed the cover from a can of Maxwell House coffee, holding it under Doris's nose while she breathed in the aroma and sighed in ecstasy. Jules was my thesis advisor while he and Ann lived had moved to their Amity Street home. Once when we fell into heated discussion over something I had written in the draft of my PhD thesis, Anne told us both to shut up and sit down for the lunch that she had prepared. That ended the discussion. Sid and Jules, while co-founding the UMass Press and the Massachusetts Review, took time to shape my career. It was Jules who suggested that I write reviews for The Nation, the first things I ever got published. It was Jules who told me that UMass was planning to open a Boston campus. And it was Sid who recommended me to Al Ryan and Paul Gagnon, who are recruiting the founding faculty for UMass Boston's opening in September 1965. The old boy, young boy network, I guess. I was hired and held on to my teaching position for 55 years, heeding the advice of my immigrant grandfather, Timothy, who once had tended the furnace at the Framingham Normal School. He told his children and grandchildren to get a dry job with the state and hold on to it. I owe it all to Sid, Doris, and Jules. Why, I have often wondered, did they care to go out of their way beyond their professional responsibilities to encourage not only me, of course, but so many? I came of age in a town where Irish, Italian, and French Catholics attended separate churches and parochial schools, where they buried their dead in separate cemeteries, where each parish was suspicious of all other parishes, where nuns told all Catholic kids that keeping company with Protestants was sinful, thus paving the way for my marriage to a Methodist. A town with one Negro family and few Jews. A town of separate clans and sharp class divisions, as I learned while caddying at the country club and later by reading John O'Hara. Sid, Doris, and Jules, I learned, did not recognize such boundaries in their lives or their teaching, their human interactions, or their hearts. They taught their students to read and write their ways out of psychic ghettos, to imagine wider worlds of thought and deed. They were true cosmopolitans, humanists, as Ben said this morning. Not nativist America firsters. Doris made me aware of Singh and O'Casey and told me to listen to Sinead O'Connor. Sid taught a course on Greek classics, the notes from which I relied upon heavily during my first teaching experience at Armstrong Junior College in Savannah. Jules taught British fiction, introducing me to Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebooks and Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Just as Sydney immersed me and others in Melville's complete works during a spring 1960 seminar in the basement of Old Chapel, my happiest academic moment. Sydney, Doris, and Jules spoke to me in voices I had never heard before, in word hordes delivered with tonal shifts, off rhythms, bold opinions, qualified by irony, humor, language which invites us to join in to discover or invent our own voices. Sometimes I spoke tentatively, but most of the time I preferred to listen to Sydney channel Ishmael or Ahab, to Doris take command of the stage to show us how lines should be read. To Jules talk brilliantly about Mike Gould's Jews Without Money or James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son or hundreds of other books. Here at Old Chapel, here at UMass Amherst, here in our minds and hearts, their presence is still felt, their words still in the air around us. Thank you.
Did Andrew Lass make it back here? Because he was also, yes, here he comes.
Andy Lass, and I'm an expat. And my thanks to Jules for taking care of the ex and then the expat. I will explain, but when I think about Jules, and like all of you, I think of him often, two things come up immediately. One is not just what he said, but how he said it, his breathing, his way of speaking. He sounded sort of like, I imagine, a wooden saxophone, a tenor saxophone, but with an odd specialty, which I don't think any saxophone player could accomplish, which is that he could speak both when exhaling and when inhaling. The other image that comes up right away is of Jules stepping onto a chair, pulling out some papers from his jacket, or actually it was black tie, and proceeding to report on the state of the Massachusetts Review. But the story goes as follows. I am a New Yorker of New York parents, but while I did grow up in New York, the New York I grew up in was actually an apartment in the city of Prague. And so I lived a life of a New Yorker in an apartment which was actually in another country, and that's the expat part of it. And then coming of age, at the time when that country was coming of age, all of you remember the Prague Spring, it preceded by several years. I, being an aspiring artist, intellectual, proceeded to hang out with all the right people, including Allen Ginsberg, who showed up in Prague in 1965 and got into trouble and probably eventually got me into trouble. Nevertheless, I was kicked out with my parents, which was probably a good idea, in the early 70s, and came to UMass for a graduate program in anthropology, and I became a social scientist and ended up, thankfully, at Mount Holyoke College. But it was Jules who I met and then invited to a session at the then Albion bookstore, which some of you may remember, because Alan was in town and I had not seen him since then, and I thought it would be good to have a conversation. So I showed him to an audience to which I invited Jules the movie I had made of Allen Ginsberg parading in the Communist May Day parade and being elected the King of May. And I showed him, he hadn't seen it, and so then we had a conversation which was recorded, and that was that, except it wasn't that, because as I would bump into Jules over and over again, usually at Atkins Farms or in the hot tub at the Hampshire Club, he would nudge me along, except he didn't use the word nudge, he used nudge. So he would nudge me. But then when Allen Ginsberg passed away in '99, he went beyond nudging me, and when I met him at Atkins, he cornered me, and I think it was next to the asparagus tray, where he said, hand it over, we're going to do a special issue of the Mass Review, and shipped over the wonderful team of Mass Review to my place in South Hadley, where we cobbled together the now wonderful special issue devoted to Allen Ginsberg and my conversations with Allen Ginsberg. But how do you thank someone who is really responsible for allowing you to come of age, not as the social scientist that I became, but as the artist that I had been in Prague, but had to leave behind when I was kicked out because I had this other identity. And it was Jules, unaware of what he was doing, because that's just the way he was, that I actually was able to come out as someone who not just hung out with Allen Ginsberg, but put together stuff and wrote poetry and photography, and got a call from his wife whether I would contribute to the special issue of Mass Review devoted to Jules. It was a big honor, so I wrote a short story entitled appropriately Julius, and I figured this is how I will thank him. I took him with me to Prague, or rather a place called Prague, which you know is not the real Prague because it's in fiction. And it was there that I allowed him to do what I had seen him do at a special event at the Amherst Alumni Club a few years earlier, where he had stepped onto a chair and pulled out some documents and presented a review of the Mass Review. And in that story, Julius, where I and him meander in all sorts of magical ways, at the end, when the city of Prague is actually flooded by water and beginning to sink, Julius, the character, steps on a chair and does like this and proceeds to fly, and flies out the window and becomes a character that we know, that's with us, on a painting by Marc Chagall. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Brief interruption from me. I just wanted to say a little bit about the afternoon events. Basically, when we were talking about this and planning what we might do, at a certain point we said, you know, if Jules was here, at some point he would say, okay, enough already. Let's get back to work, right? So basically how we set this up, and I think you'll see from the program, is it's both commemoration and symposium. So the afternoon, we've just brought some really brilliant people together because interesting things happen when that happens. I could tell you a lot about how Jules changed my life, but there's no time for that, so I won't. But I will tell you one thing, and this is something that I'm really happy that I got to talk to Jules about when he was in hospice. We decided that we would plan a new literary prize for the Mass Review to give out. This one we're going to give out every 5 years, and my managing editor would be very mad if I did not say, and we are now launching the campaign to endow this prize. This will be the Ekweme Michael Thelwell Prize for writing on race, justice, and equality. Yeah. It's funny. I can get moved by pretty much anything. It's something of a malady. But anyway, I'm going to read a quick description, and then I'll introduce Lee to introduce Werner Sollors. But this is, I think, called Preaching to the Choir, right? Since its founding in 1959, the Mass Review has played a unique role in recognizing the importance of black culture and that of other people of color in the United States and the world. An impressive list of black writers have been published within its pages, including Chinua Achebe, Tony Kade Bambara, Sterling Brown, Stokely Carmichael, Lucille Clifton, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Toni Morrison, and Ntozake Shange. The magazine has had a similarly impressive backlist for other traditions and communities, one that includes, in just the past few years, notable special issues on Asian American and Native American writing. And this legacy is due, above all, to the vision and efforts of our founding editors, including most notably Jules Chametzky, Sidney Kaplan, as well as the editor for who this prize is named, Ekweme Michael Thelwell. So, and you guys know this too, but I'm going to read it out anyway. A writer and a civil rights activist coming from a radical tradition of black arts and politics, Professor Thelwell was also the first chair of the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, a Jamaican who came to this country for college. He was a leader in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and a freedom rider. He brought together the struggles for civil rights in this country with the international dreams of a post-colonial world. He fought for a country, and still is fighting for a country he believes in, to create a world for all. So of James Baldwin, his friend and UMass colleague, Professor Thelwell comments that for the first time in any real way in the history of this country, the voice and weight and momentum of the black experience addressed this nation directly. It flayed and it lacerated and it inspired and it challenged. The quinquennial Thelwell Prize intends to honor work that continues this tradition. As did Baldwin, we hope to, quote, restore a measure of relevance, of dignity, of power to the literary profession for this nation and for the world by celebrating writers that serve as inspiration, shield, and armor in the struggle for justice and equality. Thanks.
Is Michael still here? Well, I'm going to invoke him anyway, since he just got invoked. Anybody who knows Mike knows that he is a man of many sayings. And among those many sayings, one of my very favorites is, if you live long enough, everything will happen to you. And I feel that this is an occasion for all of us in which some of that everything is happening to us. That this is a truly amazing experience for all of us who are here because we knew Jules, and we loved Jules, and we still love Jules, and the community that he made, of which we are all a part. And I do think in the civil rights movement there was a call to the beloved community. And I think today we have all experienced a bit of it. And my introduction to Werner is much in the spirit of what's been an amazing consistency in everybody's remarks, that Jules made all of us his intellectual peers. I think that's maybe a reach, and he made all of us his family. And the link between Jules and the next speaker is, again, it's both intellectual and familial. Since Jules, as they say in the intimate academic German language, was the Doktorvater of Werner Sollors at the Free University of Berlin, when Jules was doing one of his many stints there as a guest professor. Jules was Werner's supervisor for the dissertation on Amiri Baraka that became Werner's first book, Amiri Baraka, Leroy Jones, The Quest for a Populist Modernism. In another blend of intellectual and familial connection, Peter remembers helping to type that dissertation. And he specifically said, I didn't have to mention that, but of course, how could I resist? And finally, continuing this network of appropriately interconnected lineage, Werner Sollors is the Doktorvater of UMass's own James Smethurst, because he supervised Jim's dissertation at Harvard. So this makes Jules Jim's Großvater. When you meet people, when everybody is young, and when the connecting venue is the dinner party rather than the academic conference, it's sometimes hard to remember exactly how distinguished the fully grown person turned out to be. But if I were to take the time to reacquaint everybody here with even the bare highlights of Werner's career, there would be no time left for Werner to speak. So I will be brief. Werner is the Henry B. and Anne M. Cabot Professor Emeritus of English Literature at Harvard. He's had academic appointments at Harvard, NYU Abu Dhabi, which I really envy him for having, the Free University of Berlin, Washington University, Indiana University, the University of Texas, and the University of Venice, which has a fancy Italian name, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce. He's the author or editor of at least 25 books and truly countless numbers of articles and presentations. He seems to have had to write so much because his research interests are described by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, of which he is, of course, a member, as American literature, migration and ethnicity, African American studies, comparative literature, World War II and its aftermath, travel literature, sites of memory studies, multilingualism, themes and motifs, photography and visual arts. I particularly like themes and motifs because God has an interest in themes and motifs. I want to conclude this introduction, I said I would be brief, by quoting and paraphrasing from what seems to me to be a pretty smart and relevant assessment of one of Werner's books. But the assessment, it seems to me, might apply to Jules's work as well. Much of what Sollors argues for has become accepted knowledge under the general heading of the constructedness of identity and subjectivity. If, however, the argument has not, as might appear to be probable at first sight, has not been overtaken and made obsolete by the very success of the views it advocates, if the reverse rather seems to be true, and to justify ongoing discussion today, this is so because it also affords one an opportunity to reopen questions that may have been prematurely closed. These words really do seem, once again, to link Jules and Werner, with speaking today most appropriately on Chametzkyan studies and their future. Werner.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this occasion. Thanks, Jim Hicks, for all the organizational issues that surrounded even my coming here. Thanks to Massachusetts Review, University of Massachusetts, and thanks to all the speakers this morning. I mean, so much of Jules's life came to life in such a vivid way, and the testimonies continued. And since the Dr. Vater has already been mentioned, I'm going to skip the first sentence and just start with my predicament when Jim first asked me to speak on the topic, the future of Chametzkyan studies. Conflicting reactions went through my head. I thought of a conference-style paper that would go back to what would define Chametzkyan studies, the approach to literature, history, politics, writing, and editing that Jules's work embodied, then move forward to what the legacy of his work has been and what it could and should be today and tomorrow. Then I thought of the truly warm paternal relationship that Jules struck up with me right away, literally from the first moment we met in Berlin in 1970, to our last sad phone call a year ago that Peter helped me make. And so I wanted to write a memorial talk that would give full expression to my love and admiration for Jules as so much more than my mentor and role model. For Jules was a man, the word adoption has come up several times, including by kinship critics. Jules adopted me from the first moment and then gave me this feeling of belonging to that mythical 244 Amity Street, where at that time the kitchen door didn't have a lock that was ever closed, so you could just come in, and there was more than a salon because it was a constantly going on of people coming, people going. Some had already, their session was finished, and more coffee came out on that Bremen furniture. So he also made me feel that I was part of his family, and so much so that I witnessed his and Anne's 3 boys developing and becoming, one by one, an ethical lawyer, a quick-witted linguist, and an imaginative art historian. So that was the second thing I thought about. Then another thought crossed my mind. I shall be speaking, and I am now speaking, to an audience that need not be familiarized with Jules or the outline of his life, since so many of you knew him, many of you much better than I did, his real family members, his partner, his friends, his colleagues, and his students. Since what you should expect today is difficult for me to do. It will be probably an intricate mishmash of scholarship and friendship infused with a palpable dose of what one could call adopto-filiopietism. And for many of you, what I will say will not be surprising, but will hopefully bring back more of your own memories, perhaps completely different from mine, including the stories that he varied. Jules would have been the first to say, and I quote him now, "We must confront the Rashomon aspect of experience. Things look different to different observers, and that's one of the perceptions that are shaped, and that one's various perceptions are shaped by the social and cultural context out of which one operates." So, I try my best. From the bird's eye view of hindsight, one could say that in the past half-century, Jules and I were both navigating the inadequacy in Germany as well as in the United States of old centrist academic approaches in which we were trained, by invoking and calling urgent attention to the points of view of those who in the past and also still in the present were excluded at the margins of the mainstream. Margins and mainstream became a topic for us. We did this in the name of literary justice without wishing to idealize new forms of determinism and exclusion. But for Brooklyn-born Jules, 15 years older than I was, the confrontation with that center was direct and the result of lived experience. Last month in Venice, I thought of Jules when Joshua A. Cohen, in a book presentation of his novel, The Netanyahus of 2021, argued that the generations of Bernard Malamud, Saul Bellow, and Philip Roth had many certainties in common that they could proclaim to their readers. By contrast, Cohen's own generation, he was born in 1980, was no longer in a position or in the mood to proclaim anything with any degree of certainty, except perhaps in Cohen's case, a limitless admiration for Harold Bloom. What would Jules have asked him? Was my question. Cohen's point seemed to have been that what he regarded as the older cohort of Jewish American writers and intellectuals to which Jules belonged, while writing about Jewish topics, tended to reduce the difference to the Christian center. What came to my mind when he spoke was the moment when Saul Bellow translated Isaac Bashevis Singer's Gimple the Fool for Partisan Review, and the only linguistic marker of the Yiddish source language and of the use of Hebrew words that he left in the English text was the word challah. Otherwise, everything is anglicized, and Bellow translated Singer's El Malay Rachamim into the Christian God of Mercy, a shift that Hannah Worth Nasher observed transformed Gimple's East European setting into Southern Baptist terrain. Yet Eastern Europe returned, like the proverbial repressed, in the next novel Bellow published, Seize the Day, also in Partisan Review, in which Bellow's character, Tommy Wilhelm, pays a man to say a prayer, and that man wants to be tipped for El Molei Rachamim. Bellow adds, still, for the English reader, Thou God of Mercy. I wondered, was one of the certainties that Cohen's older generation of Jewish intellectuals and writers faced not the then firmly established reality of anti-Semitism that was worrisome in America too, though not by a long shot, quoting Jules, when compared to Germany at the same time. It was worrisome enough that the refrain of Jewish critiques of Portnoy's complaint was that it gave ammunition to anti-Semites, which implies that a certain cautious procedure was called for among Jews themselves. So it was possible for a Jewish professor of American Studies in an English department then to internalize this complex and to avoid hiring too many Jewish faculty members. This is what Jules himself experienced when he was told by Leslie Fiedler that Jules could not be hired because Fiedler had already hired a Jew, and Fiedler, Betsky, and Chametzky sounded too much like an East Side clothing store, not like an English department. Here I note Jules's penchant for, in writing and teaching, for the small, weirdly humorous, but also sort of destabilizing anecdote that brings something quickly to a point, something that speaks volumes, as we say. Jules even added later a little exoneration of Fiedler in the form of another anecdotal account of an experience that Jules wrote up and I witnessed when in the early radical 1970s in Berlin, Fiedler was asked to give a lecture in the America House while students outside were protesting the Vietnam War. The director assured Leslie that nothing would happen because he was being protected by police dogs. At that moment, Leslie said, I can't lecture while being protected by police dogs. I'm leaving at once. And so Jules immediately got up and walked out, and I walked out with Jules as well. So we were in a small group of people who left behind the kennel that was behind the speaker, looked behind where the barking dogs are. So Jules added still, after having exonerated him, also this nice Jules's method of adding his misgivings about Fiedler's earlier comments on the Rosenberg's execution, as if something in their language of writing letters had kind of justified the execution. It was a terrible essay that Fiedler wrote right afterwards. But then Jules added perhaps Fiedler had come to regret these comments later on. Now, all of you know, and I've heard it today, that Jules went to Brooklyn Technical High School and Brooklyn College, and from the New York environment, he absorbed an abiding interest in politics and culture. He went on from there to graduate school to Minnesota, and also that we've heard. In retrospect, he always stressed that that's where he became an Americanist. But at the time, he began, and we've heard that too, with the expectation of becoming a playwright, working with Eric Bentley, who took a leave and then left. So that didn't work out. But then he shifted his interest towards studying metaphysical poetry and Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, and wrote his dissertation on reason and desire in the plays of John Marston. Yet the many personal and professional encounters he had at Minnesota were more decisive for his development. I think there's also one source for this gregarious method of Jules, surrounding himself with important people for his own development. So he met the poet Anne Halley, who became his wife. He met his lifelong friend, the photographer Jerome Liebling, and he encountered the leading Americanists of the pioneering generation. The field was only established in the 1930s and 40s, and here in the 50s he had the pioneers, Henry Nash Smith, Leo Marx, Alan Trachtenberg, and this is the group that he began to feel comfortable with. We saw the document today. I have a sentence here: having been a fellow traveler, never a member of the Communist Party, but still subjected to this hassle, he was now an Americanist on his way toward Chametzkyism, which I would summarize as joining the NAACP, writing a commentary on Jerry Liebling's documentary Pow Wow about the Chippewa Native Americans in Minnesota. In short, beginning to think about matters of social justice through the lens of race and ethnicity and the crucial ethnic fault lines in the United States. An anecdote Jules tells reveals the connection between his past and his new and abiding engagement, that word also, that engagé that showed up in the letter. It concerns an encounter that Jules had at Minnesota with the writer Isaac Rosenfeld, whose novel Passage from Home Jules liked, and I'd love to see the marginal comments in the edition if he also sent that along to one of his grandsons. There's a scene in that novel in which the young protagonist Bernard seeks out his bohemian aunt Minna, and the title of the novel, Passage from Home, refers not to the migration of the family to America, but to Bernard's relocation from his parents' home to that of his Bohemian aunt. Bernard waits for her outside the office building where she works, and in the city's crowd, he has contradictory emotions of feeling part of these other lives, yet also completely alone, isolated, an object among objects. He wonders, thinking of God, in whom he had once believed as a child, why was there so wide a gulf between person and person? And why should one man be a Negro, another have freckles, a third a yellow mustache? Or the Negro, why was he a Negro and I a Jew? Why not the other way around? Or both of us Negroes, or both Jews? It's a wonderful passage, and this is the center of the novel, goes on, that has often been seen as the embodiment of Bernard's alienation and of Rosenfeld's existentialism. In Rosenfeld's essay, The Situation of the Jewish Writer, an essay Jules reprinted in his Norton anthology, Rosenfeld had written, "Jews are marginal men. As a barometer of political calamity, the Jews in this country are second only to the Negroes. The Jewish writer is a specialist in alienation, the one international banking system the Jews actually control. If alienation puts him in touch with his own past tradition, the history of the diaspora, with the present predicament of almost all intellectuals, and for all one knows, with the future condition of civilized humanity." Now, this passage reminded me of the quip that Jules liked, that the Partisan Review office supposedly had a typewriter with one key that spelled alienation right away, so he had to. In his last book, Out of Brownsville, Jules included a warm portrait of Isaac Rosenfeld. In it, Jules writes about a small detail, and I think this is a very, very big detail once you think about it. He said, "I had read an essay of his in Partisan Review when a phrase caught my attention. The phrase was about something totally useless, which Rosenfeld said, quote, would help like cupping the dead. I didn't realize why it stuck in my mind until a few pages later. The phrase was a translation of a well-known Yiddish expression, es wird helfen wie a teuten Bankes. It would help like blood cupping a corpse. I had known it all my life," Jules said, "somewhere in the deep recesses of my mind. Now, this use of Yiddish in translation, or even in the original, is a commonplace. But then it hit me like a wonderful and surprising revelation. One could do that. There was a whole world lying under one's skin, a veritable Atlantis. For some of us who had grown up in the first and second generation Yiddish-speaking and reading communities, which we had put behind us as in our quest for a place in the real America. Rosenfeld was among the first to include that kind of material and language in his work. So here, rooted in a sentence that startled Jules, from a writer whom Jules liked and met, is one of the many origins of his fascination with a mediation of difference that does not domesticate it and make it hidden, and make the hidden word disappear completely, but that makes an Atlantis visible or audible in an unusual English phrasing. An expression Jules had known all his life, his Yiddish upbringing in Williamsburg, and Martine's wonderful poem this morning made that so physically present. His upbringing took place in a family with Russian, Polish, Jewish origins. His location was that of the second, the American-born generation, and we've also all seen the photograph that Jerry Liebling analyzed so wonderfully with 22 relatives all together posing of several generations, and some of the mothers holding photographs of their sons so that symbolically they would be included in that photograph, including Jules's brother Leslie. The difference may be subtle, but it's culturally meaningful. On the one hand, there's Bellow's translation that domesticates and makes innocuous and invisible Singer's Yiddish in the English text. And on the other hand, there's Rosenfeld calling attention to the Yiddish origin of an unusual simile, the English translation of which would stick in Jules's mind and provide him with a wonderful and surprising revelation. In a small detail, Jules managed to recognize an echo of his own world in a translation that revealed rather than hid its origin. but Jules had also recognized that this two-toned reading applied to others. As he put it, every Jew in Christendom, every woman in a male-dominated world, every Southerner in the United States, every person of color in a racist society knows that there are at least two answers to every question. In his endeavor, he has never lost sight of a deep sense of irony that has made him such an effective teacher of serious issues, with the help of jokes and true stories that might well be jokes or become jokes. This method also helped to drive home Jules's deep suspicion of the center and the single master answer to all of life's questions. Now fast forward to the early 1970s, a heady time, half a century ago, when I met Jules and he generously invited me to team teach with him in Berlin. Having spent a year at Columbia and in New York, I was developing a sharp 1960s-inspired interest in Black American literature. I taught the first course in Black American literature then at the Free University, while also being in a liminal state as a first-year assistant professor at the John F. Kennedy Institute in Berlin. There, conservative, centrist, and pro-Vietnam senior faculty was at such odds with junior faculty that some seniors would not even speak with juniors. And one faculty member denounced the whole Kennedy Institute in a widely circulating publication, a right-wing publication, as Institute for Anti-American Studies, and repeatedly through the 70s into the 80s tried to close it down. Miraculously, Jules, by the way, stopped or helped stop the closing down at the last effort before then there was an electoral change. Miraculously, Jules was able to speak with everyone, though he clearly represented the anti-Vietnam and pro-minority studies camp and defended his line patiently, both against the conservative senior faculty who evinced very little interest in Negro literature and against super radical Maoist and Leninist student groups who like to disrupt classroom discussions. Jules once invited Mike Thelwell, and one of the Maoists thought that he was for sure a CIA agent, you know, that they like to work with blacks who sound radical was her, her reason. Jules came from a background of having supported Black studies, as you all know much better, giving ample room to African American literature and criticism in the Massachusetts Review and his own teaching and scholarship, long before departments and programs appeared at American universities, and he helped the University of Massachusetts to create an Afro-American Studies department. Jules had actively recruited Black students to it with the help of John Hope Franklin and Sterling Brown. Jules had also just brought out, together with the unforgotten Sidney Kaplan, the book we've heard about before, Black and White in American Culture, a wonderful collection of pieces on Black history and literature that had appeared in the Massachusetts Review. And I don't think you would find another, outside of Black American magazines, another magazine in the United States at that time that would be able to put together an anthology of that bulk and substance on this topic. The Journal of Negro History reviewed the book with praise for the cultural approach, a chiaroscuro which made possible a wide range of material that called attention to, quote, the problem of the inhumanity of white to black, which the authors perceived to have touched every aspect of the culture. And then it concludes, this cultural approach, seeing the problem in the total cultural setting, is a pioneer effort and should be emulated. And this getting from the Journal of Negro History was a wonderful review. Our teaching with Jules was a formative experience for me, for teaching the significance of slave rebellions in American history and literature meant working through cases from Nat Turner, about whose rebellion Henry Irving Tregel, one of Jules's former students, was then putting together a vast source collection, through to the Amistad case with a Sidney Kaplan essay from Black and White in American Culture in it. And long before I heard the word multiculturalism, Jules proposed that we teach another course called Broadening the Canon, working with the anthology Speaking for Ourselves, where I was first introduced to teaching Latino writers, teaching Hisai Yamamoto, Asian Americans, and he also recommended his own former student, Edward Ivkovich's anthology, American Letter, Immigrant and Ethnic Writing. So it was in the course of that semester that I began to think of African American literature not only in contrast with general or white American literature, but in the context of other minoritarian constellations, both in the United States and abroad, each with a somewhat different fault line. These team-taught courses elicited many excited student discussions, and I was impressed to see how Jules could both raise the temperature when the mood was flat, or more often when the students hadn't read the assignment, and how he could calm the waters when discussions got too cantankerous or got stuck on the issue of class alone, looking at race, ethnicity, gender only as epiphenomenal to the one crucial issue that the leftist students were then interested in. Jules was also actively engaged with cultural life in Berlin. We went to Afro-German and African bars together. With his old love for the theater, he was excited by the famous productions of the Theater am Hallischen Ufer. Ibsen's Peer Gynt he had a big poster of that, and turned off by the museal atmosphere in the Theater am Schiffbauer Damm, Bertolt Brecht's old stage, where we actually walked out, and we have the second walkout scene, we walked out of a production of St. John of the Stockyards that was attended almost exclusively by East German policemen and soldiers. So it was very, very strange. There was required theater going. When drama critic Eric Bentley came to Berlin at Jules's invitation, so he had the old drama connection coming to life again, Jules was amused by the story that the academic title-savvy but not worldly wise border police held Eric at Tempelhof Airport because he had claimed to be a professor, but his passport didn't say Professor Dr. Eric Bentley. So, and the title, Craziness in Germany. While in Berlin, Jules was working on a lecture to deliver at the German Society for American Studies. I was cleaning my office 2 days ago, and I found a tape recording which I suspect is a recording of that lecture, but we haven't been able to get beyond the introduction, which has been going on for a long time. I hope we'll still be able to listen to a snippet of Jules speaking this. The lecture was titled Our Decentralized Literature. When he gave it, it caused a sensation. And when it was published a year later, it became a manifesto for comparative ethnicists and a challenge to those Americanists who would soon be called canonical. Jules took William Dean Howells as his point of departure and wrote, when Howells used the phrase, our decentralized literature, in an 1899 article, he was acknowledging a fact of our literary and national life, but giving it a largely geographic significance. Thereby, he was minimizing a graver possibility, that of a lost center, defined as where he, Howells, had long stood to American culture generally. So Jules distinguished in that lecture George Washington Cable's Grandissimes, which went to the heart of the American race complex with its haunting story of Bras Coupé at the center, from such liberal Southern novels as To Kill a Mockingbird or Intruder in the Dust, novels that Jules wrote, and here again he's not pulling any punches, novels that exploit the theme of race in the South in ways that are uplifting to a certain kind of white reader. In these books, true aristocrats join force with women and children to save the abused black from corrupted post-slave rabble. In this process, the misery of the blacks is simply an instrument for the moral instruction in noble individual values of the young white aristocrat of the spirit. Bang! You know, this on To Kill a Mockingbird, Intruder in the Dust. By contrast, Cable, and even more so the then largely unknown novelist and short story writer Charles W. Chestnut, explored the deeper meaning of the abiding legacy of slavery and the abandonment of Reconstruction. Chestnut's Goofer Tales, Jules argued, embodied the first conscious fictional form given to the black ethos in America. He explained that this term, his use of the term, drew on Sterling Stuckey's definition as lifestyle and set of values which prevented black people from being imprisoned altogether by the definition which the larger society sought to impose. And as I'm writing these words, I'm thinking again of Jules's comment on this phrase, cupping the dead. Jules highlighted Chestnut's Uncle Julius's story and his ironic construction of a narrator whose biases readers must see through in order to get to the black ethos at the core of each tale. The white narrator was an unreliable translator, a domesticating and flattening figure, and Chestnut's irony was lost on what Leroy Jones, in his quick dismissal of Chestnut, had failed to recognize. Since my dissertation topic, that the whole Chametzky family was involved in seeing through to completion, my topic was Leroy Jones. I was especially intrigued by Jules's daring also to dismiss, who was an icon at that moment by for a bad reading of another black writer. When in the same lecture Jules turned to Russian Jewish immigrant Abraham Kahan, he quoted Howells's praise of the simplicity and purity of Kahan's language as the English, quote, of a man born to write Russian. It is simply marvelous. Jules inserted a sick and added, Kahan was born to write Yiddish. And then continued, reassured himself, Howells reassures his reader that Kahan really is one of us. The center holds. So skepticism of the domesticating center also characterized Jules's reading of Kate Chopin. What does surprise one is the modernity in numerous small and large ways of Mrs. Chopin's insight into the woman question. It is not so much that she advocates women's libidinal freedom or celebrates the force of the body's prerogatives. Our post-Freudian age, she adds, has won those battles, or should have. Nor is she terribly explicit about the mechanics of sex in the contemporary way. What Kate Chopin shows so beautifully are the pressures working against woman's true awakening to her condition, to what that condition is. So while employing the method of close reading that was then often taken as the formal sign of canonical traditionalists, Jules had launched a polyvocal challenge, and he was fully aware of what he was doing when he undertook these broad and then unusual comparisons between a mainstream figure, Howells, who does not come off terribly well, and 4 writers on the margins who were contained under the label regionalism. Regionalism, Jules said, was old-fashioned American studies. Looking back at that essay, what he argued instead was that their work was, quote, about the black question, the woman question, the immigrant and ethnic question. That's what we are interested in now. In From the Ghetto, Jules's book on Abraham Kahan, he pursued the immigrant question more closely as a question of language. In Kahan's characters in the novel Jekyll, A Tale of the New York Ghetto, the old language did not deal with such concepts as love, while the new one is grasped only in cliches. The result is a sense of acting out forces they cannot comprehend, the characters in the book. When the characters speak in a third language, Jules used this phrase before Homi Bhabha made the third space popular, as it were, of the native Yiddish transposed into English, there's a hint of an inner richness, more of an inner richness than their English suggests. In this, of course, lies the poignancy of the immigrant generation, the theme beautifully developed later on by Henry Roth in Call It Sleep, a novel that I first read when team teaching with Jules. An important point. Jules called attention to the significant differences in Kahan's writing when he told the same story in English and in Yiddish. Jules, I think, was the first who did a methodical comparison of stories that existed in these 2 versions. And it's a line of inquiry that later scholars like Aviva Taubenfeld and Sunny Yodkov have followed and inspired much work in criticism of bilingual, multilingual writers. Now, Jules found, to give you the quick summary of what he found in the comparison, that Kahan's English versions were more restrained in representing sexual matters and tagged on a happy ending, whereas when told in Yiddish, an omniscient socialist narrator seemed sufficient. This was an excellent way to find out what the politics of readers' expectation, or said differently, how a writer imagines the differences between a mainstream and a marginalized audience looks. When Jules published this manifesto in book form, he stressed the positive developments since then. We are now more aware of diversity in America's past, the multi-ethnic nature of its culture, the dangers of narrowly conceived ethnocentrism, that he warned of the opposite danger of forgetting the Americanness of so much American ethnicity. The critic who argues that only a black critic can interpret or evaluate black writing, or only a Jewish intellectual with a certain urban background can appreciate Portnoy's complaint, is surely mistaken, replacing an old orthodoxy with a new one. In an interview, the German Americanist Ulfried Reichert asked Jules, and Jules still saw that interview, it just came out in 92, right? I mean, when Jules was 92, he asked Jules, could we not say that today there's a danger that American literature is too fragmented? Here's what Jules answered. You say fragmented, but I do not think that way. I look at America differently. I think of it as my country, but it has been conservative from the foundation, think of slavery, with only a few exceptions. Abolitionism, the progressive movement, and the New Deal. Only 3 movements with progressive ideas. That's it. We do not need a new constitution now. I argue for social democracy. We need the necessary infrastructure, education, basically a New Deal. We have ethnic movements now, and that is our only hope. No worry about fragmentation. Yet Jules also saw developments in literature that differentiated the groups he had seen more in analogy early on. Jewish writers, Jules said, in our time seem largely to have been accommodated to the core culture, perhaps because in the 40s and 50s they lost or gave up, with a few exceptions, some of the fundamentally critical potentialities or perspectives in the work of their predecessors. He thus seemed to sketch a change that's almost the opposite of the one Joshua Cohen saw. Jules continued, the descendants of Chestnut and Chopin have only more recently emerged to challenge the augmented center. It may well be that the black challenge will be more uncompromising than the earlier challenges, while women are only at the beginning of an assault whose full dimensions remain to be seen. You'll probably agree that these were truly prophetic comments. I think most of you know that Jules was committed to fight for equality and justice. I have tried to show how Chametzkyism worked that out in a few facets of his approach to literary criticism. The remaining question is how Chametzkyan studies might look in the future. My ability to make prophecies is distinctly inferior to Jules's. Hence, I would like to try to face this difficulty by way of thinking about Jules's particular charisma in going about things, which hopefully might inspire scholars of the future. Let me present at the beginning and in lieu of a conclusion an unsystematic list of a few inspirational things I noticed about Jules or was inspired by Jules to note, a list that you may feel you wish to expand on or to trim. Let's think of the big picture, even in a small detail over which we might stumble when we read anything, and Atlantis may reveal itself. Jules sometimes invoke Kafka, as in, Kafka said to a Jewish audience in Prague, "You know more Yiddish, ladies and gentlemen, than you know." Let's employ the emperor's new clothes style honesty. When we hear a predictable paper boringly presented, let's call it, as Jules did, automatic pilot writing in response to one of those MLA papers that drag on and on. Or when editing a journal, and most stories that arrive one season contain scenes of a character vomiting, tell each one of the authors that they are part of a deplorable fad. Let's be loyal to family and friends and keep remembering core issues. Let's think of the politics of writing and publishing, of being in the world. Let's always try to be ready to get away and follow our adventurous spirit. Let's travel, let's go abroad. Jules and I were in many places together, from the original IKEA furniture outlet in Sweden to Carmen's tobacco factory in Seville, from Memphis, Tennessee to the Italian Dolomites, and we sat in an old Mercedes that broke down, fortunately close to Frankfurt Airport. Let's develop limitless curiosity about worlds elsewhere, about other places, and most especially about other people. Let's cherish incongruities. I don't know how many of you remember Jules's Yugoslavian suit that he got in Dubrovnik. He had a tailor made a suit for him, but the only material that the tailor had was material for overcoats. So it was, a rather funny suit to have. And he loved that it was, this was an absurd object. Let's take our time. Jules did so much, but he never seemed to be in a hurry, and yet could set up a huge antipasto plate in 5 minutes, arranged to make it look like a chef had done it. Let's cherish the telltale anecdote and lighten up. Let's see the weird humor also in our own positioning and posturing. Let's think of litmus tests. Jules heard that during World War II, Germans would use conversation partners' reaction to the German occupation of Paris as such a test. How do you like the occupation of Paris? The calm opening. If they didn't like it, they could be trusted. If they liked it because they hoped it meant peace, they might be okay. But if they liked it because they had always wanted to buy property in France, then you knew you couldn't trust them. So what are our litmus tests today when we deal with difficult issues and with people we know might have rather different opinions from ours? Let's make a heated debate feel like a dinner conversation, and a dinner conversation feel like an extraordinarily lively debate. Let's like disagreements, and let's learn from disagreements. Let's work on our art of conversation and learn to listen as well as to speak. The ear may be the linguist's most overlooked organ in understanding how language works. Let's be ready to be surprised, be it by people or by places. Let's also be surprised by what we find in our own research, and let's go with what we find, not with what we expected to find. Let's teach and preach elegantly and avoid direct orders, saying instead, I happen to read that, and you might also be interested in it. That was a classic Jules opening. And yes, let's not replace old orthodoxies with new ones. Ladies and gentlemen, I probably didn't do any of the three things which I promised you a mishmash at the beginning, but I did love Jules.
So I believe we're heading on to our next panel now, just assembling ourselves. So just while people get settled, I just want to say what a moving and wonderful day it's been. Truly extraordinary talks we've just heard as well. And just to mention that there's been a slight change of plan in this panel, in that Hilene Flanzbaum, who was meant to be with us, couldn't come. So her paper will be graciously read by Susan Fellerman instead. So my name's Stephen Clingman. I'm a professor in the English department at UMass. And when I came here, one of the first people I met was Jules. And he, to myself and my family, did what he apparently did to everybody else, is he befriended us. And they took us in. They literally took us when we were between houses. Jules and Anne hosted us in their attic, in their house in Amity Street. And everybody loved Jules. I loved Jules as well. I do want to mention just one thing about him. There have been so many recollections, I can't resist one of my own. And that was when Jules was in hospice towards the end of his life. We went to see him. And of course, I went in some trepidation, not knowing what I was going to find. What I found was that
Jules cheered me up. He really did. And one thing he said, I hope I'll never forget. He was in a bed next to a window, a beautiful view. The birds used to come visit. And he said, every morning when I wake up, and clearly he wasn't sure that he was going to wake up every morning, he said, every morning when I wake up, I'm happy to be alive. It was just an amazing thing to hear. So today's panel is called Chiaroscuros of the Possible. And I thought I'd say a word about the title, which might be confusing to some, although with knowledge of Jules, the chiaroscuro will be familiar. I'd suggested this title to Jim and our working group because it seemed to me to go to the heart of a lot of what Jules was about. Chiaroscuro was a term that he often mentioned to me, as I'm sure he did to others, and he got it from Sidney Kaplan, who used it to define his focus on the interaction of blacks and whites in the nation's images of itself in history, literature, and art. And it seems to me Jules embodied that perspective in so many ways, all the ways that we've heard about today. On our campus, he had the closest possible relationship with members of the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies. He was friend to and host of Chinua Achebe and James Baldwin. He saw American culture at large as a kind of tapestry of interaction, as we've just heard, in which differences existed but were not reduced to one another, but were in conversation with one another. In his own life, he brought so many things together. As editor of the Massachusetts Review, as founder of our faculty union, and many of us are still grateful for that today, as scholar and editor of Jewish American literature, as director of the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities. He explored and exemplified in so many ways the chiaroscuros of the possible. What was possible in this world of difference and interaction, and how we could begin to make it a better place. And at the same time, this seemed an opportunity to consider Jules's relevance, not only in his own right, but also as we go forward, his legacy, in other words. In our time of sometimes rampant identity politics and radical divisions of various kinds, are those chiaroscuros still possible, or possible in the same way? How can we find new ways of extending Jules's spirit and vision, the way he was in his life as well as his work? We can think of this in relation to social and cultural issues, or aesthetics, or medium, literature, culture, history, photography, art, or in disciplinary terms, because Jules was, to his bones, I think, interdisciplinary in outlook. So I've suggested these thoughts, and I mentioned them to the members of our panel, and I want to stress that I did so not to tie them down, and they may have nothing whatsoever to say about these things. But I hope some of these ideas will resonate through what we're about to hear and through our conversations today. So because of the change in plan, we had thought we'd go in alphabetical order, but little surprise, we'll go in reverse alphabetical order. And we're going to begin with Hilary Plum. And I think I'll introduce them one by one as they come up to speak. So Hilary is the author of several books, including the novel Strawberry Fields, 2018, and the work of nonfiction, Watchfires, 2016, which won the GLCA New Writers Award. A collection of poetry, Excisions, is forthcoming from Black Lawrence Press. She teaches at Cleveland State University and in the NEO MFA program, and she is Associate Director of the CSU Poetry Center. Her essay collection, Whole Studies, that's H-O-L-E, is just out with Phonograph Editions. Hilary, over to you.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here and to meet all of you. And it's been a very moving day so far, so thank you all for sharing your recollections and work. I didn't know Jules Chametzky, so I was invited here by Jim Hicks, and through kind of Jules's literary legacy, I feel, through the Massachusetts Review, which Jim edits. And I also am an alum of UMass and of Amherst College, so I've been in this area, which was obviously very touched by his work. When I learned the title of this panel, and I know Stephen just spoke to this, Chiaroscuros of the Possible, I felt a momentary trepidation because I've never known what the word chiaroscuro meant. This seemed like a disadvantage, a tiny site of shame. Knowledge is preferred. Yet the title of this symposium is also honoring the intellect, fostering justice and equality. And I reminded myself that the intellect is defined by the practice of ways of knowing and not simply the possession of knowledge. Process, not product, as it's sometimes put, especially among us teachers of writing. So in a short talk, I'll try to honor the interdisciplinarity of Jules Chametzky's work and his commitment to the promise of the humanities, with just some small reflections on literary writing, experiments in form and ways of knowing, and cultivating possibility, or how ideally new forms may allow for transformed and newly empowered social, cultural, political understanding and activity. I'm a writer, an editor, and a teacher of writing at a public university. I often wonder, what is a writer an expert in? If our field is largely a practice, more form than content, is that a field or a way of being in fields? This fall, I'm publishing a book called Whole Studies, which considers writing as work, as labor. I have variously said when asked that it is about art and activism, attention as a transformative practice, difference and collaboration, adjuncting and the margins of the academy, whiteness and its weapons, professionalization and its discontents, the radical importance of surprise. The term Whole Studies, which is named after Courtney Love's band Hole, for reasons I'll get into a little, became, as I was writing, a term of art, meaning how to listen to something that's already there, but which needs your listening to be fully there. I was trying to practice to honor some everyday ways of thinking and knowing that are often undervalued, under-recognized, suppressed, dismissed, excluded. Material and systemic oppression is also and must be epistemic. Witness how the powerful are known to us, but needn't know us. Fostering justice and equality needs new forms and practices of knowing, new ways to listen, recognize, imagine, trust, unlearn the hierarchies underlying what we previously knew. And the newness we need is often already right there, if we can learn to recognize it, to listen openly to it. What I mean is something to do with the revelations of the Me Too movement. These weren't revelations of new knowledge, really. They were common knowledge, newly empowered. An open secret about a powerful man and those who protected him was suddenly made visible by legitimizing media. Suddenly it was revealed, though it had always been right there. But now it mattered. Now it was in the New York Times. But before that, always, many, many people had known. Their knowledge and experience was often dismissed as rumors, no matter the directness of their testimony. These people were often women and children. Often they were workers who could be, then were, replaced. Often they were people who had been forcefully objectified and sexualized and treated as bodies, not as thinkers or knowers. Sometimes they were even famous, but dismissible, such as in the example of Courtney Love, who provided a perfectly clear public warning on TV about Harvey Weinstein in 2005, a warning that was ignored and for which she was professionally punished 12 years before allegations about Weinstein began to appear in The New Yorker and The New York Times. These knowers, who are us, are people whose working knowledge about vital matters is not readily recognized as expertise, even by ourselves. When I started thinking about this situation, I felt a sense of responsibility toward it because, as a writer, I've often felt that I was presented in the role of an expert without knowing what my field of expertise was expected to be or feeling that I necessarily had one. For example, my second book is about the Boston Marathon bombing and how metaphors of illness have been exploited in the American rhetoric of the so-called global war on terror. The Boston Marathon bombing serves as a case study just because it happened one day as, coincidentally, my husband was getting his first cancer surgery. I was trying to relate the body to the body politic. The book draws on my own experience of illness and indeterminate diagnosis as a lens, means to examine how the radiating imperial violence of the war on terror is represented in media and consumed by readers. How we encounter, and I hope how we can intervene in, the ideologies sustaining that violence. To build justice, we must recognize the forces in play. We must have a way to know them as other than inevitable and total, but instead as just one possibility that can be countered and overturned. In writing this book, I also just wanted my illness to be good for something. I wanted to think with it, even if I couldn't justify that method in advance, even if illness often feels, or is made to feel, like an opposite of intellectual work. After the book was published, when I was invited to do events or class visits, people asked me a lot of questions about the Boston Marathon bombing. This made sense. Yet I felt myself in an argument, some state of minor alienation or non-recognition. I was an expert in form, not content. The book is a work of literature, not journalism or history. It's about structures of thinking and feeling and remembering and reading and imagining. I had built some possibilities for thinking about the bombing and using the bombing to think. This isn't the same as expert knowledge, I don't think. What can literature be a cause of? This question appears in the book, and so seemed like the sort of question that it might be right or useful to ask me. But in classrooms, people treated the form as a means to get at the content. I had thought the form was a means to get at the possibilities of form, how form may allow for other new contents. I guess I was trying to show how content is form because I believed this recognition could create new possibilities. But often people asked me about the book's content as if it was formless between us. I know about writing essays, I wanted to say. That's the main thing I know about. I really believe in the work of reading and writing and what it can do for all of us. If we're talking about any subject, if we're talking about what something means, we're talking about reading and writing and feeling and thinking and imagining. So that's what I like to talk about. My own illnesses have not been a cancer of the body, they've been in the brain, sometimes described as psychiatric, sometimes neurological. The brain is one organ, but apparently two fields. And this too leads to some problems with knowledge. It leads to a lot of uncertainty. It leads to an ethos of suspicion of certainty, a sense that your own knowledge can't be trusted. So you'll have to find some ways to live and trust and think that will work beyond the content of your momentary thinking. You'll need adeptness in form because the content is unreliable. You are going to think thoughts you can't trust. You are going to know yourself, allegedly the one true site of your expertise, unreliably. For example, over 20 plus years, I've had a couple thousand neurological episodes, which are generally called migraines, a term that often seems inadequate. I often don't know right away that I'm having one, don't recognize what's happening, even as the episode follows the exact same pattern as always. For migraine sufferers, this failure of recognition is common, though I thought I might personally just be very stupid until I read a helpful book by Oliver Sacks. Someone may need to ask you, are you having a migraine? The brain stops witnessing itself. As an episode begins, I often fall into a hard state of uncertainty. This state erases awareness of itself. It arrives as a sudden totality. It's not that I feel uncertain about something particular. I, my whole self, am uncertain. At its worst, in this state, it feels impossible that I could ever know or say something for sure. It feels less and less possible to communicate, to know how to say something and know what one would want to say. A deep, debilitating wave of feeling asserts that anything you say couldn't be wanted or understood, that your knowledge might be as flawed as you are, that everyone knows something about you that you can't know, which is that you don't know yourself and your thinking can't be relied on. A state of uncertainty becomes and is a profound state of shame. Knowledge is preferred. This neurological destabilization of my thinking and knowing is not a voluntary or a disciplinary practice. It feels bad, but perhaps confronted every day with hierarchies of knowledge in the world that we shouldn't trust, a world where structures of knowledge may be power wielded against the vulnerable. I can use this destabilization again later, or that's what I've been thinking. Perhaps we can work with it. A lack of stability is the potential for a transformed order, a countering of hierarchy, a recognition of the mutuality between knowing and not knowing, since you are always living in both fields. Distrusting the knowledge of a moment may become an openness to other ways of knowing, to listening to others who are there, to something else that is real, beyond what you thought you knew. You're open because you're desperate, and that's a good start. When I eventually consulted Wikipedia, I liked learning that in visual art, chiaroscuro is a collaboration between light and shadow to create a world-expanding effect. Like knowing and not knowing, contrasting elements are there together in collaboration, and both are needed. At its best, a new writing project has this desperate, vital, open power. It feels like you're finding a way towards something you need to know, or should get to know, or should make yourself know, but which there hasn't been a way to know. You're discovering a new way to make discoveries. You can only get so far yourself, then readers will arrive in their multiplicity and difference, and they'll start their work. It's not that the possibilities are endless, it's that they really are there, and in any lucky moment of the text, there is here. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary. As chair, as moderator, I'm clearly going to do the musical chairs things because there are 5 of us up here and only 4 chairs. So next up is Nathan McLean, who's a poet and author of Scale, published in 2017 by 4-Way Books. He's an assistant professor at Hampshire College, a Cave Canem Fellow, and serves as poetry editor for the Massachusetts Review. His new collection of poetry, previously owned, is just out with 4-Way Books. Nathan.
My extreme gratitude to Jim for inviting me out to be part of this celebration, certainly to Stephen for moderating, and grateful to be on this stage with my other panelists. I'm looking forward to being in conversation. Jules Chametzky and Sidney Kaplan closed the foreword to their 1969 Black and White in American Culture, an anthology from the Massachusetts Review, with the discovery that, quote, every aspect of the culture is touched by the, in the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, special enigma of the time, the inhumanity of white to black, end quote. They go on to recall the famous, or perhaps rather infamous, assertion of W.E.B. Du Bois, remarking that, quote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, end quote, the truth of which they deem inescapable. Sadly, I did not personally know Jules in life. However, the salience of his realization, coupled with Du Bois, remains all too relevant, sobering, and familiar. I cannot honestly say whether this country is in worse shape than it was when that anthology was originally published, but it often feels worse, at least only to speak for myself as a black person, though I imagine women might feel similarly. Because the problem of the color line persists. As we are gathered together in this space, remembering and celebrating the legacy of a man who, I have learned, prized interdisciplinarity and collaboration, the U.S. Supreme Court has just begun a new term and are poised to rule on a number of deeply divisive cases, among which a case challenging the long-standing precedent of affirmative action using race as one factor among many to achieve educational diversity. And this court will likely rule in favor of proponents who would see it made unlawful for universities to try to achieve educational diversity by making sure there is a critical mass of minority students, notably Black and Hispanic. Because I am an educator, and one who teaches in a primarily white institution like others in our consortium and all across the country, this is important to me. The questions Stephen posed at the beginning of this panel and how he's framed this panel's discussion are also important and timely. Are we able, in such a time of identity politics and radical divisions of various kinds, to extend Jules' spirit and vision for the world? Those chiaroscuros of the possible. And are they possible in the same way? I recently read that, quote, a group in Wisconsin claimed President Biden's plan to cancel up to $20,000 in student loan debt violates federal law by intentionally seeking to narrow the racial wealth gap and help black borrowers, end quote, because, and studies have shown evidence of this to be true, a considerable percentage of white Americans will oppose social programs that benefit them, because they think too many black people will benefit as well. A very similar racial resentment was at the root of growing opposition of white Americans for the government welfare program some decades ago. Once black Americans were able to benefit from the program, it was then denigrated and demonized, particularly through the caricature and stereotype, the myth really, of the welfare queen. But I want to stay with academia, as that is where my occupation is located. The final example from the current news cycle I will call upon is from a recent article detailing and ruminating on the events surrounding a recent incident and subsequent uproar at Arizona State University, which maybe some of you have read about, which I believe functions as a cogent metaphor for the country at large. In short, the incident involved two white male students, one wearing an anti-Biden t-shirt, the other brandishing a Police Lives Matter sticker on his laptop, who allegedly trolled a new multicultural space on ASU's campus and were confronted by two of ASU's students of color and activists, one female, the other non-binary. The incident also filmed and shared widely online. As you might imagine, the video went viral. At this point, viewed nearly 6 million times. If I had more time, I would delve more deeply into the long and contentious fight to establish a multicultural space on ASU's campus, as well as their lack of support for students utilizing the space, forbidding students to decorate the space, leaving the space nondescript with very little signage designating it as such, forbidding them to post rules for how to use it, and the university would not provide students with dedicated staff members to help organize events or gather resources. While white students were not excluded from the space, it was simply not to be a space that centered whiteness or white dominance. It was to be a safe space. The students of color involved in the incident, as well as the faculty who supported them, even obliquely, were subjected to hateful posts, racist, homophobic, and sexist threats, and threats of violence, their inboxes filled with images of black people lynched or killed by police from literally everywhere. Politicians and right-wing pundits got involved, ASU's funding was threatened, and ASU would later investigate and discipline the students of color involved for violations of their student code of conduct. This is who we are, and where the challenge for me lies in encountering signs that read Black Lives Matter in local boutique shop windows and staked in my neighbors' front yards. It is not because I don't believe it is a powerful organizing anthem, but because it forces me to counter an existential crisis such that if the thing has to be said and be displayed, it must mean that it's not true. I didn't personally know Jules, but I believe this is where he might disagree with me. He believed in a true spirit of exchange, in peaceful yet meaningful coexistence, and I want to align my belief with his, but it isn't simple. Kaplan used the term chiaroscuro, as Stephen mentioned, to define the interactions of blacks and whites in the nation's images of itself, history, literature, and art. But these are so often the chiaroscuros I see. Perhaps what Jules can teach us is the benefit of small, incremental progress, baby steps, one relationship, one class, one poem or story or essay at a time. When I was approached about assuming the helm of the poetry section for the Massachusetts Review, the magazine and the country at large was at an inflection point. The magazine wanted to re-energize the spirit bolstering its work and building upon Jules's legacy to, quote, promote social justice and equity along with great art, aesthetic excellence, as well as public engagement, end quote. I believe, for Jules, public engagement and Kaplan's chiaroscuro are synonymous. And I hope that with each rejection or acceptance, each conversation and piece of exchange I have with the poet about their work, each suggested edit and its collaborative effort to honor not only Jules's memory, but his vision, his inward and forward looking. I worry that as I grow older, I grow more and more cynical of this country and its established institutions, that I find it more challenging day after day to see not only the good in them, but the good that is possible. Kaplan's chiaroscuros, as I have presented them, look quite bleak, I know, but they are not without hope. Why otherwise, why continue to do all that we do? Why write, revise, teach, or mentor? Why grapple with the individual and collective memory, if not only to properly understand the past, but to prevent its repetition in our own lives? Why forgive? Why pursue justice? Why extend empathy? Why love at all? As academic institutions have become more inclusive in recent decades, many universities have shifted from their traditional purpose, that being the pursuit of truth, the discovery and dissemination of knowledge, in favor of a different mission and pursuit, the achievement of true social justice. Though there are some who might argue that justice and truth are inherently incompatible, and that we must choose either one or the other, that you can't have both. I didn't personally know Jules, but I believe he would disagree, for that is precisely the mission of the Massachusetts Review. So, as a model for all of us, he might still pursue both, or die trying. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Next speaker is Nia Imara, who's an artist, writer, and astrophysicist, which I think is a completely cool combination. She was born in Oakland, California. Her art reflects her love for vibrant color, for people, and their stories. Nia studied astrophysics at UC Berkeley and did her postdoctoral research at Harvard. She's currently an assistant professor of astronomy at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she investigates how stars are born in the Milky Way and other galaxies throughout the universe. So I think we can expect some cosmic wisdom. Nia, it's yours.
Good afternoon. It's such an honor to be here, and I want to thank Jim especially for inviting me. I didn't know Jules either, but he published so many of my heroes, and because of his work and his commitment, I had the opportunity to be published in the Massachusetts Review. It's really been an honor to be in the presence of someone who has made such a difference in people's lives and just the world. I'm happy to know that he was committed to social and racial justice and that he was a true friend of the struggle for Black liberation. American schools are still largely segregated. Most of my work as an artist, a scientist, and an educator focuses on young Black people. And I thought that the best thing that I could do to honor Jules today would be to share a short story with you, something that I hope he would have appreciated. Given his respect for and support of Black literature, I thought I would offer some Black literature. The story is set in a high school classroom. Our Black youth are traumatized almost daily, and they're so impressionable and sensitive. This story is called The Persistence of Vision. The boy was long in every way: legs, torso, face, long arms, and long fingers. He sat hunched over the desk like a gargoyle, his bent legs crammed underneath as if by a miracle. Large knees were attached by long shin bones to long feet that poured all over the cracked linoleum floor like wet cement. It was a most undignified sight. She couldn't get them off her mind. Every time she turned around, the gangly feet in their soiled, patched-up sneakers snatched at her eyes like a purse thief. It seemed to her that they hadn't once budged since the students crowded in that morning. A gargoyle was lodged to the back wall of her class, its interminable feet resting like the dead in their dirty coffins. She called on him. Without unfolding his bowed back, the boy raised his head, his lips parting mutely. He didn't answer the question asked of him. The teacher repeated it. A low sound came from Devante's throat, as though from a long, long way off. He scratched his head, scanned the markings on the chalkboard through earnest, squinting eyes, scratched again, and grimaced painfully. For a full minute, the teacher waited in silence, her attention never completely straying from the twin sarcophagi cemented on the floor. "Miss Rodney," a voice finally erupted, "he don't know." "And what about you, Diana?" answered Miss Rodney. "Do you know?" "Don't none of us know. All your screeching on the board is making my ears hurt, and all that chalk dust is giving me a headache." "Since when?" "Since always. You're not even sitting that close to the board." The girl already referred to as Diana shrugged her shoulders as if the situation were completely hopeless and tossed an incredulous look to the girl seated in the desk beside her. In fact, she addressed her entire side of the conversation to her friend, not bothering to make eye contact with the teacher or even troubling herself to turn her face in that direction. "All right, Diana," the teacher said, her voice straining with suppressed exasperation. "I need you to try to stay focused." Diana sighed, the sweet scent of bubblegum riding on her breath. She twisted a thick braid around her finger and blinked slowly at her friend, saying, "You messin' with my asthma." "Yeah, Miss R," somebody threw in from across the classroom. "I got asthma too. I can't concentrate, it's so bad." "Me too," cried a couple more. "We can't see through all this dust. This white woman trying to kill us with all this pollution. She's trying to murder us." The class exploded with laughter, and a torrent of fresh accusations, each more creative and incredible than the one before, crashed against the unlucky teacher in a wave. How did it happen like this, she thought, so suddenly? Her eyes darted anxiously around the room. Eventually, they settled on Diana. She watched her blankly, feeling lost and paralyzed. The girl was laughing dispassionately. She sat amidst the chaos, her bored head leaning carelessly on one hand, with the air of a queen watching over her subjects. She whispered something through the cacophony to her friend, as though unaware of the glowering, increasingly desperate presence at the front of the room. The teacher wanted to break through the girl's studied coolness. She had created this pandemonium, and now, clearly, she was putting on a performance to show how untouched she was by it all. Then, without noticing at first what was happening, she felt her gaze being drawn away from the girl, subtly at first, and then irresistibly, as though by a powerful magnet, toward the back of the room. The twin black coffins, the sight of the boy, his elongated body all hunched over the desk, filled her with dread. Every morning it was the same. Why did he unnerve her so? She couldn't say. She only knew that those coffins for feet didn't help. With tremendous effort, she tugged her eyes away and refocused her attention on the girl, and she felt her heart tightening. Devonte Marks was working on a problem that he had been obsessing over for days. Earlier that morning, moments before the start of class, the piece to the solution he finally needed had fallen into place. He brought out his notepad, bent over his desk, and shut off everything that wasn't immediately pertinent to the question at hand. The teacher's scratches on the chalkboard, child's play. They added but one more layer to the white noise that hummed steadily in his ears. He had worked his way through geometry and algebra 2 summers ago. He had no need for what she was trying to teach them now. When she called on him, he felt as though he had suddenly been extracted from another dimension. They, the teachers, always seemed to catch him off guard. He saw them as if through a haze. The question at hand was this. He wanted to know how many photons it takes to see an object. Could the human brain, in theory, register a single particle of light entering the eye? If not, what was the bare minimum number of photons needed to register a conscious response? He wanted to calculate the answer with as little Googling as possible, but a key piece eluded him. He knew that the size of the pupil mattered. He knew that the efficiency had to be taken into account as well, that the human eye wasn't 100% efficient, that only about 1 in 10 photons entering the eye make it as far as the retina. He also knew that in a dark environment, the rods were more sensitive to light than the cones. But there was still something missing from his calculations. And then, out of the corner of his eye, as he drifted head down to his desk earlier that morning, he saw a classmate rapidly scrolling through photos on her phone. And feeling that someone was staring down at her, Diana suddenly whipped her head around and, before Devonte could brace himself, threw him the friendliest, most genuine smile. Keep those beautiful eyes of yours open, Devante, and keep your head up, Kay? Devante met the friendly, amused face and nearly smiled back. But inside, he was filled with joy. He had found the missing piece he needed for his calculations. The key was the frame rate, the number of intelligible images per second flashing before the eye. He went to work and didn't see the time pass. Suddenly, a tight, chilly silence penetrated his body, causing his long spine to unfurl like the leaves of a young fern. The white noise had disappeared. Devante raised his head. All was silent and still. Every set of young, artless brown eyes was fixed to the front of the classroom. Though Diana was still seated at her desk and nearly half the class was standing, there was a clearing between the bodies through which the side of her face appeared directly in Devante's line of sight. Intuitively, he understood that she was at the center of it all. He watched her intently. Then, in the briefest of moments, within the space of the tiniest fraction of a second, something awful worked over Diana's face. For a flash, her expression was transformed by a profound, ineffable anguish. Utter bewilderment and sorrow poured from her child's eyes. But it lasted only a blip. It's possible that no one else but Devante observed it. Diana's pretty, youthful, impervious face with its full lips and bubblegum breath had already resumed its regal air. Her gaze was once again steady and confident, though now it was charged with anger and injured pride. She was the first to cleave the silence, straight down the middle. "What the hell did you say to me?" she said evenly. All the eyes pivoted upward toward the teacher. She was drained of blood. She swallowed and blinked. Her shoulders sagged to her knees. "Calm down, Diana," she said, smiling weakly. "Say my name just one more time. Tell me to calm down again, I swear. What do you think I said? You're mistaken. What do you think you heard?" The girl leaned back in her chair and silently scanned the teacher up and down with a look of unmitigated disgust. At present, slowly enunciating her words, Diana said, "What do I think I heard?" "We all heard you," cried half a dozen students all at once and from all sides of the room. "We all heard you. You called her a black..." And that was all it took. The class welled up with one voice, drowning out the friendless teacher with its wisecracks and ridicule. In the back of the class, the boy was stuck with an image, the ineffable thing on Diana's face, which just moments ago had ambushed him with a disarming smile. He had the nagging thought that he himself was to blame, that he had created the thing just by being aware of it. Before he looked, the possibilities rising from within to the surface of her face were infinite. But by looking, he had collapsed a wave function and transformed all of those limitless probabilities into something hard and real. Keep those beautiful eyes open. Was it worth it to let everything in? When he closed his eyes and looked inward, at least he knew he could tame whatever wild infinities he discovered there. 9.1 billion, it was much, much less than that. In the space of 1 second, a photon bounces back and forth between the hyperfine levels of the cesium-133 atom just over 9.1 billion times, the definition of 1 second. The duration of the thing on Diana's face had been a tenth of that, maybe. The key was the frame rate, and the key to the frame rate was the length of time the brain retains an image, no more than a tenth or a 15th of a second, and any variations that happen faster than this can't be clearly discerned by the brain. But Devante had caught the image, and it persisted. He wanted to unsee it. That awful, shredded thing on Diana's face had struck like lightning from her core to his, branding his mind's eye. He longed to locate some kind of corporal refresh button to reset his brain and make the vision disappear, to replace it with the image of an arresting smile. He desperately wanted to unsee. Pencil still in hand, suspended over the aborted calculations, Devante muttered the words to himself over and over again. Refresh, 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 refresh. Thank you.
Thank you, Nia. Wonderful story. So next, Susan Fellerman is going to read Hilene Flanzbaum's paper, which she sent to us. And I should probably say a few words about Hilene as well, even though she's not here. So she's a professor of English and the director of the MFA program in creative writing at Butler University. Her specialties include modern and American poetry, Jewish American literature, 20th century literature, and creative writing. And one of her areas of particular pride, I'm sure, was being a co-editor with Jules Chametzky, John Felsteiner, and Catherine Hellerstein of Jewish American Literature, a Norton anthology. And Susan, we're very grateful to you for taking on this task. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. This is kind of odd. I'm going to be Susan Fellerman for a moment, and then I'll be Hilene Flanzbaum. I did know Jules. He was my father-in-law. I knew him for a long, long time, since 1980. And I'm not someone who's usually without words, but I really was without words to contribute this morning, so I'm happy to have an opportunity to speak to everybody about Jules, because Hilene's paper is much about Jules. But before I become Hilene, I just want to say that I'm also an art historian and a film scholar, and so the word chiaroscuro is very familiar to me, and we use it in both of my fields, and persistence of vision in film studies as well. So I feel very connected to this panel, even though I wasn't the person invited to be on it. I also don't know, I think these remarks might be a little long, so I'm going to take the liberty of shortening a little bit, and maybe signal me if it seems like I'm going too long, and I'll cut to the chase. Okay, now I'm Hilene. It is easy for innocent lovers of literature to make mistakes in grad school, thinking as they do that grad school is a place where they have to come to nurture their love of literature, rather than the place it is, competitive, painstaking, and damned hard work. It is not, at least in my experience, romantic or idealistic. It took me several years to catch that bus, and before I did, I made the following mistake. In an introductory conference with the grad student director, an English and Comp Lit professor, and a noted scholar of high modernism who published with the University of Chicago, she asked what I planned to write my dissertation on. Without hesitation, I told her, the literature of Jewish American immigration. How should I describe her reaction? Mirth? Scorn? Ah, yes, derision. That's it. I'm not sure why I had said this to her. I had not prepared for the question, and it was the first thing that jumped into my mind, though I had little knowledge of Jewish American literature at that time. At 15, I had stayed up all night to finish Herman Wouk's novel, Marjorie Morningstar, amazed that there were Jewish characters. At 23, an itinerant poet and adjunct, stepping to cover a class at Tufts, I had inherited a syllabus that included Goodbye Columbus. This was not my first experience of Roth. My first was stealing Portnoy's Complaint from my parents' bedroom and reading the dirty parts, but otherwise not having the vaguest idea of what was going on. Reading Goodbye Columbus at 23 and teaching it, I recognized parts of myself. I recognized my relatives. I thought I wanted to know more. I thought maybe if I read the right kind of books, I would understand our peculiar neuroses. Yet all through college, I had never taken a single class in Jewish American literature. Did they even exist? I'm going to shorten the next paragraph, which is about Hilene's experience at Brandeis, where she was, I guess you could say, surprised to find that although there were a lot of Jews at Brandeis, let me just quote one line. We were Jewish. What was there to talk about? Jewish American literature as a category of study did not exist. And she lists some professors that she had there who were Jewish, but that they taught courses in classics. She lists and mentions parenthetically that Jules wrote his dissertation, as we know, on a Jacobean playwright. That had been the 1950s, she said, when Jews got jobs, even in places like Brandeis, or should we say especially places like Brandeis, it was because they were experts on white Anglo-Saxon writers, not because they wrote Jewish poems or had written dissertations on ethnicity, nor would it have been prudent to do so. In the mid-'80s, when I had said that to my chair of graduate studies, who was also Jewish, of course, if one still accepts that model of dissent rather than consent, it was 1986. Things had not begun to ease, at least at Penn. She taught Eliot, Pound, and even Wyndham Lewis without noticing their anti-Semitism. To notice anti-Semitism would mean that you cared about being Jewish, a deadly admission were one to succeed in the first tier of higher education. To complete this personal story, and because you might be curious, I did not have the courage to oppose the advice of my graduate chair. Because I thought myself a poet, and because one of my mentors at Brandeis was Frank Bidart, I wrote my dissertation on Robert Lowell, a straight, WASP male. The work was rewarding enough, but in retrospect, not the most savvy career decision. But this is not the point of the story, but maybe it is, because so many of us that would later, after tenure, work in Jewish studies, had first to prove themselves by working in the tradition. Even Alvin Rosenfeld, who runs the Indiana University Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, wrote his dissertation on William Blake and got his first job because of that specialty. I did not realize that when I chose to work on Lowell rather than Kahan or Anton or Yezierska, I was just following in the tradition of so many of the passing Jews before me. I observed, too, that if I had the courage to do what I wanted, I would have met Jules, at least his work, 20 years before I actually did. For Jules published his first book in 1977, From the Ghetto, the fiction of Abraham Kahan. Today, in the MLA bibliography, one can count over 100 essays that include lengthy discussions of Kahan. Only 6 of those came out before Jules's book did. The bravery of Jules's choices is worth celebrating. Those who dared to write about Jews were few and far between. As Leslie Fiedler said of that period, we were taught to be Protestants in the streets and only Jewish at home. Jules was Jewish at work. In 1984, trendy English departments were deep in theory. Less trendy departments may have been fighting it, but it would eventually get on the theory train. The writers themselves, Roth, Bellow, and Malamud, were busy saying that they did not want to be called Jewish writers. Everyone wanted to be universal. But in the Kahan book, Jules talked about everything that those trained in English departments had been taught to avoid: money, class, religion, politics. For a period in American history, there was a disproportionately high number of Jews in American academia. In the second half of the 20th century, the percentage of Jewish faculty was at its high in the 1970s, when 25% of the professoriate in Ivy League institutions had descended from Jewish families. Jules's background was far from unusual. Second generation, from an urban area, educated at Brooklyn College. What was unusual was how, in his work, he embraced his native culture as a source of identity and meaning. We could name half a dozen of the greatest literary critics of Jules's generation in English departments, and scores of whom were of Jewish descent, but who would not consent to be Jewish, at least publicly. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, identity politics had just begun to percolate. For feminism, it was a notably fertile time, but the rest of us, and I was in grad school during that time, for the rest of us, and I was in grad school during that time, theory was the end-all. Deconstruction mesmerized us. At Yale, the premier institution for all things theory, both Jeffrey Hartman and Harold Bloom were preeminent. In what strikes me as a perfect example of how committed the practitioners of deconstruction were to separating text from author, in this it was very like the new criticism on steroids, Jeffrey Hartman and Paul Deman, whose Nazi sympathies later became evident, worked side by side, committed to the cleansing intellectual fire. Eventually, however, safe in his perch and protected by trends in the academy, Hartman turned to the Holocaust in After the Great Silence, and even to memoir. Very late in the 20th century, Bloom too turned to his point of origin and fell back on his training in Talmudic Judaism to point out that much similarity lay between it and the practices of deconstruction. Eventually, some cultural historians would dare to observe that perhaps Derrida's background as an Algerian Jew may have had something to do with it all. Could it, in fact, be true that who we were, where we grew up, how much money we had, and how the larger culture dealt with us helped to shape what we thought about the world and literature. These evolutions are fascinating to those of us in Jewish studies, but I mention them now to further underline how absolutely enlightened Jules was from the very beginning. In 1984, 7 years after he published his book about Kahan, Jules continued to talk about regionalism, identity, and class in our decentralized literature, cultural meditations in selected Jewish and Southern writers. The title of the book in itself makes Jules's claim: everyone is not having the same American experience. The first chapter, entitled The Significance of Regional, Ethnic, Racial, and Sexual Factors, could today be read as an open challenge to most of that critical generation. Both politics and keen perception brought him to the position that texts and opinions, even from esteemed venues like Yale, even coming from extreme venues like Yale, do not appear sui generis in the world. The statements that sound like truisms today were unpopular and in certain places could be career killers. New historicism had not grown past an adolescent phase, and like the rebellion of adolescence, such ways of viewing the world were denounced by stern and forbidding gatekeepers. In 1972, a group of literary scholars stormed out of the MLA convention because panels about ethnic writers were not being accepted. They formed their own organization, Milas. But until 1980, that organization had fewer than 50 members. Looking back, we can note the importance of such developments and see them as beginnings of a great and necessary change in the Academy. Jules, and a very few like him, unwittingly perhaps planted the seeds of that revolution. After he disposed of a dissertation about a 16th century playwright, he was consistently committed to this path. I noticed that on Jules' Wikipedia page, which maybe someone in this room wrote, his work forsaged the new historicism and cultural studies. I agree, and I am happy to think about it that way, but we should note that forsaging or prophecy can also come with pariahdom, and that for a long while, Jules was an outlier. The happy confluence of events, that Jules was here at UMass, that he had gotten tenure so early in his career, that he had UMass Press behind him, and most important, his commitment to his own lived experience and that of other marginalized groups, is why we gather here today. Now I have to jump forward a few years to talk about Jules and the project we worked on together, the Norton Anthology of Jewish American Literature. We began this project in the late 90s, when identity studies had a firm hold in higher education, and AJS, Associated Jewish Studies, had begun to share its various platforms with scholars of literature. Norton's Anthology of African American Literature had been published some years earlier. Smaller collections of Jewish American lit were available. Jules had, in fact, advised on several, but those had been published in paperback for what editors hoped would be popular consumption. Such collections had no academic prestige and covered only the 20th century. Our anthology would be different. Norton was the sine qua non of academic prestige, and it would be published in hardback and go beyond those writers that everyone knew, beyond Saul Bellow and Emma Lazarus, beyond Roth and Marge Piercy, back all the way to the first 23 Jews that landed in America with Peter Stuyvesant, cover each century, and end in the contemporary moment. As Jules said many times, it was a labor of love, because the compensation was not much, but also because it really was. There were 4 editors, and I was the collaborating editor, but I leaned on Jules. He took the section that we called From Margin to Mainstream in Difficult Times, 1920 to 1945. But more than this section, his spirit presides in what I think of as the lightness or playfulness of the anthology. When he made suggestions about other sections, they veered towards more popular inclusions: Leo Roston, S.J. Perelman, Dorothy Parker, and Hortense Kalischer. A couple personal anecdotes. As the collaborating editor of the volume, I had the responsibility of writing the introduction. I could not. At the time, I had just finished postgraduate work with Walter Ben Michaels, who scoffs at such identity positions. When I began to write, I could not find my footing. Of my graduate professors, Barbara Herrnstein-Smith was the most influential. Contingencies of Value was my Bible. I began each draft explaining how Jewishness was an imaginary category. Not the best approach for an anthologist, and not at all what Norton had in mind. Thank heavens that Jules took over the task. Every time I read the essay that opens our book, I am reminded of his overarching and practical genius. It was the genius for understanding what is important to individual human experience. Nowhere is his spirit more present than in the special section on Jewish humor. Each of the editors was charged with a supplemental section that rounded out the Jewish American experience in the literary arts. Catherine Hellerstein and John Felsteiner worked on translation. I worked on Broadway. Jules worked on humor. He had always wondered how we could sufficiently portray the special character of Jewish American life. He did it in this humor section, which he introduced with dozens of cultural references, including Freud, Du Bois, Bergson, the Marx Brothers, UNESCO, Sophie Tucker, and Lenny Bruce, to name just a few. It's an amazing piece of scholarship, but ends, of course, with inscribing some really good jokes. So as Jules himself would do, I am going to end with a good and educational Jewish joke. And this is from the book. I wish I could do a Yiddish accent. A shipwrecked Jewish Robinson Crusoe was finally rescued after 20 years alone on his island. The rescuers were astonished to see a magnificent 3-story construction of stone, palm, driftwood next to Robinson's humble hut. "What is that?" they asked. "My shul," he proudly replied. The sailors were impressed. Rounding the island with him aboard, they were surprised to see an identical 3-story construction on the other side of the island. "What in the world is that?" asked the ship's captain. "That," said the rescued man, "that is the shul I don't go to."
Well, thank you, Sue, for service above and beyond. While you think of questions, we have some time for questions, Jim? I think a little time. I teach a course on South African literature and politics because I'm from South Africa. And just today, in fact, Monday and today, we were reading a play called The Island, which is based on Antigone. But I was talking about the value of laughter, or the various ways in which laughter can be used. And one of the ways it can be used is for survival. People who can laugh will survive another day. And if you can laugh at yourself, you really are going to survive another day. So, which brings me to a thought. I mean, we've heard different presentations. We've had poetry, views through poetry, through fiction, through nonfiction, through photons embedded in a work of fiction. One thing that struck me about Jules is that he was always encouraging. You looked at Jules and you just sort of felt a kind of courage in the world. And Jules had lived through some things, as many people have. But I'm not sure if Ilan Stubbins is still here. Ilan described Jules, and I think he was right, as a kind of compass. If Jules was pointing in a certain direction, you knew it was a good direction. And I felt that too. I certainly felt it. And so I just thought, as a way of introducing something or other that might allow each of our panelists to speak a little bit, never mind whether you knew Jules or not, but and in relation to your own work and the world today, we know the world is not in a good place right now, but could you speak about courage, the persistence of vision, what keeps us going, what keeps you going in your work? It could be very personal, it could be political, it could be just about anything. So excuse a strange and wild question, but if you feel like taking it up, please do so.
I would say, at least for myself, and with regards to my own work, part of what keeps me going is certainly curiosity. I think especially with any type of writing that I'm doing, part of the reason that I'm doing it, writing tends to be, at least for me, the way that I kind of work out what it is that I'm thinking. And in fact, I know sometimes there tends to be, with writers, this kind of dichotomy that's established between sort of thinking and feeling. But I tend to think that thinking is what, or define that thinking is what human beings do with experience. And so I equate and I couple feeling, or fold feeling into that. So part of what certainly I think keeps me going and keeps me writing has to do with curiosity and trying to figure out and to understand how I'm feeling about particular either lived or learned experiences. With regard to my work, certainly as an educator, absolutely my students are probably one of the primary reasons that I keep going. Right now, at Hampshire, we have a very sort of unique system of advising, and so students form their own advisory committees, usually made up of 2 faculty members, and I have students who are entering sort of like their second division of work right now, and in my inbox, or at least as far as my committee requests are concerned, I have currently 16 or so requests from students, and this is the first time that I would say that maybe 13 of those students are Black or students of color. This has certainly never been the case, and I think part of that is that Hampshire is being able to bring more students of color into, and more students of color are feeling comfortable coming to the school and are getting more support and more funding. And I just know for myself that I don't recall having any faculty of color when I was growing up and when I went to school, and so I think I understand the importance of that, and that's also something that I think is increasingly important to me as sort of a model or an example or just even a point of contact for all of my students, but especially my students of color.
Do I have to press anything? No. Okay. That's my first. Thank you so much. That was so nice. I guess I would echo the hopefulness of teaching, and I feel that way too in a way that's, it's both very, very present. I mean, teaching is very inspiring and feels very fortunate to get to do, to get to support, people, whether young people or of all ages, as they work on something that's just important to them, regardless, with no knowledge of the outcome or what it might lead to. But it also can't be romanticized, right? The students are, we're in institutions that are pretty underfunded and besieged. Students are facing the debt crisis. They're facing some pretty difficult economic and political realities coming from and continuing to face and waiting on the doorstep. So that hopefulness is kind of right up against all the things that challenge hope, and maybe that makes it even brighter, even as you can't sort of romanticize it, right? It's still there. And I feel similarly I work in small press publishing. I've worked in independent publishing since about 2004. It's really not going very well. We've really been kind of pushed to the margins of the publishing industry, the book selling industry by Amazon and by the kind of major publishers. It's a pretty, we're not really thriving exactly. We've lost a lot of ground. So, but similarly, people kind of just keep doing it, and they persist in doing it just because they believe in it, and it's great to talk to them because it's also like not that romantic, right? Everyone's just like complaining or like gossiping or what, but that's the good stuff, right? That's how people are making books and diving in and kind of believing in a book again and putting it out there because, you can't say what's going to happen, and you believe in what you don't know about the effects that a book will have. So I think that those are both places that where I get to witness people's courage and people supporting each other's courage.
For me, my history in large part is what gives me courage. When I think of what my people have been through and how they were brought to this country, or when I just think of my own grandmothers, so history plays a big part in my courage, and also just looking at what people are going through today and the suffering and seeing people still finding ways to have joy and to smile and to sing. Those are examples that I want to follow and that I aspire to.
Are there any other questions out there? Well, I want to thank our presenters, and I think that Jules would be on your side, no matter what it is that you're doing. Jules would absolutely be on your side. So here's to Jules, here's to all of you, and here's to everybody here today.
So next up is a brief coffee break.
Okay. I want to start by saying that I'm one of the many people here whose life was made livelier, broader, more engaged, thanks to Jules, and also because he and Bruce Laurie talked me into taking the presidency of the union after them. Thanks to them, I got to go to a lot more meetings. Many meetings, many meetings. And I have to say that not only was Jules great at meetings, he was great at the after meetings, when you get together with your friends and talk about what idiots your opponents are. So I never wanted to give up the idea of Jules as being somebody who was very good at being angry or opposed or offended by the stupidities and limitations of the people around him, but he made it all seem kind of fun. It was more fun to be where he was than to be on the other side. Two more memories of Jules. One was that he had two-toned shoes that he loved. Jules was a stylish man. And the third memory is an anecdote which I have in very, very limited form. Jules had discovered an episode in the fight over Kansas and whether it would be a free or a slave state. That, you know this, Robert, you're nodding. Two of the people who are struggling side by side in this battle, one of them makes a statement in Hebrew, and the other answers in Yiddish. And Jules was so delighted by this because it brought together so many things. The struggle for freedom, the presence in America of all kinds of different people coming together. So I think that the melting pot was not for Jules. It was the notion that you were all together and all yourselves. And I think the panel we have here are people who speak from positions of both a recognition of the complications of American life and the recognition of individual voices. So let me, it's a very eclectic grouping. 3 writers and a linguist, which could be the start of a good joke, but it isn't. I think it's the start of a lively discussion. And as you can see from the program notes, our speakers are all people who write in a variety of forms, in different languages, in different cultures, and I think that's very appropriate for a session honoring a man who took light in understanding different voices and experience. I think each panelist will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes, and if you don't mind, I'm going to introduce everybody collectively at once and then call on you. So I would like to start with introducing Jules Michael Terry, named for the man who was a friend and a mentor to his parents, as Esther told us this morning. I think Michael's work begins, as it were, almost before writing, in the interplay among mind, world, understanding, how language itself and how we process language is shaped by culture for good or ill. I hope that's a fair assessment. Then Douglas Anderson, who is local, who has published in the Mass Review, and which Jules helped found. And his work, history and the personal intersect. He's interested in the essay, in poetry, in photography, in commenting on culture, on history through art, and that in a way his images are a reflection of the valley around us, but also the discussions that take place in the valley, as it were. The valley, the happy valley, is a kind of sacred space to us all, even though sometimes we think we should all escape it. Jacqueline Loss is an academic, a translator, somebody who, she has a great title, Caviar and Vodka, for caviar and rum. Yes, yes. And so she works on Cuba, Russia, the intersection of the various connections between old and new worlds, between America and Cuba, and discussing the ways in which we imagine and think about these other worlds. And finally, Robin McLean, who has another great title, her latest book, Get 'em Young, Treat 'em Tough, Tell 'em Nothing. So a fiction writer who has also been a lawyer and a potter, who's lived many places and is now a teacher of writing in the West, and has also been a union organizer, which is another connection to Jules. So let us begin with Michael and his talk of what Jules could have understood what he said.
Good afternoon. As Professor Diamond said, I am Jules Michael Terry. I say that not because I think you forgot, but because today's a good day to stand up and say that I'm Jules Michael Terry. I want to begin what will be some very brief remarks with two admissions. The first is that this has been a wonderfully full and filling day. And so the first of my admissions is that I admit to being quite emotional right now. The second is actually a little embarrassing. Knowing I would be in this state and being a little nervous, when I wrote to the organizers of today's event, I wrote to them asking, what kind of paper should I deliver? What kind of paper should I write? And that began what I now understand to be a huge misunderstanding. I was under the impression that we would not be reading papers. So it may be of perhaps of some surprise and maybe some joy to some of you that I don't have a paper to read. So what I'd like to do instead is to offer a few remarks about the work I do and how it connects to the topic of the panel discussion, different voices and different voices, shared values. Right? And I want to, as I'm doing that, much has been made today of Amity Street and the conversations around the table with always good food at Amity Street. And I want to think of my remarks today as something of that sort. I want to think of it as being in the presence of the Chametzkys and sharing what I'm doing and hoping that it connects with what they're doing, and I hope that Jules would be pleased. So in thinking about today's topic, the panel topic, what came to mind for me was a quote from Alice Walker. She has one of her characters say, "Look like to me, only a fool would have you talk in a way that feel peculiar to your mind." And I think that quote reminds us all of the complication of different voices entering into conversation when those voices are expressing an authentic self. And I think of as a core value, and if you'll permit me to call it such, a Chametzkyan value, that we not flinch in the presence of that complication. It's rich and important. In the very first coffee break, I was talking with Robert about having grown up on Meadow Street. As my mother mentioned, she and my father bought the house that the Chametzkys had lived in, and we were musing over whether there was something about the room that we both possibly shared that turned us both into linguists. As a linguist, that quote is particularly interesting to me. It's particularly interesting to me because one of the few, and in fact I think the only marker of difference in grammar in that quote is the absence of that third person singular S. Look for looks, feel for feels. And that's been very important to me in my work, as much of the work that I've been doing as of late has been investigating what kinds of grammatical differences cause trouble for second graders when they're first going to school and taking tests and being engaged in a conversation that's not necessarily in the language they speak at home. And that particular marker, my colleagues and I have found to be very important in a study that we've conducted. We've been able to show that the more instances of that third person singular S there are in a math word problem, not written but read out loud even to second graders whose home language doesn't have it, the worse they do. And by significant margin. For about 15% of the students we looked at, it made about a 9% difference in their test scores. And most recently, we've been able to confirm those results, but also to measure the brain waves of children as they listen to those kinds of questions. And through those means, to begin to gauge what it is for a verbal S to feel peculiar to the mind of a second grader. And so as I think about that work, there is the Chametzkyan value of not flinching from the complication there is. But I think there's also a Chametzkyan, for me, a Chametzkyan challenge. For me, the challenge has been sitting across from a second grader who I know is going to answer a huge amount of problems wrong because of their experience with that S. To ask myself where that second grader stands in relationship to much larger questions, where that second grader stands in relationship to world literatures and what is literature, where that child, especially as I think about some of the ramifications of that work, the fact that in the field I'm in, many people assume that problems that deal with dialect, right, are problems of reading and reading alone. And when I think then that there is something prior to reading, there's an experience of text. There's an experience of language that may have an effect. I'm prompted to think about what that tiny little difference means for writers and authors and people engaged in conversations of all types. the work I do is often very technical and very abstract. I talk about it, and it's often talked about under the umbrella name of investigations into African American English, right? The differences between the language of people related to those formerly enslaved and the broader, bigger culture. I'm reminded in that, though, that it's never just about the small, it's never just about the technical. That the very first investigations into the language of African Americans as such, at least those very first formal linguistic kinds of investigations, we can trace that back to 1924 and the work of George Philip Crabb. Was very much interested in what of the former slaves' language, what did it retain from earlier Englishes, and where was it going? And the work that he did was thought of as being important enough to be covered in the Pittsburgh Courier at that time. Not because people were interested in small little differences or the history of those things, but because, as the newspaper writer wrote, it signaled some sort of hope for the future as far as the Negro was concerned. The idea was that if the language of the slave was becoming more like the language of polite society, that maybe there was some hope for integration. I would note that the newspaper writer wrote of that as being surprising and astonishing. So as we are today thinking about these questions of different voices and shared values, I think there's room for the kind of things that I as a linguist think about. And I think there's room for for myself as a linguist to grow and to embrace a broader conversation that I think is rightly called Chametzkyan. And with that, I'll sit down and let others talk.
Doug, do you want to speak from there or from here? Whichever. Okay. Doug Anderson?
I didn't really know Jules, but I am a beneficiary of his many good works. Over 30 years ago, I began to publish my first poems, a number of which appeared in the Massachusetts Review and were included in my first book. And they gave me a great deal of validation as a poet. I'm very grateful to the Massachusetts Review. I want to read a couple of poems from that group. Itinerary. In Arizona, coming across the border with dope in my tires and for months tasting the rubber in what I smoked, with a college degree and a trunk full of the war. Working in one place long enough to get the money to stay high for a month and then moving on. Drinking a quart of whiskey, then getting up, going to work the next day. A little speed to burn off the hangover. In the afternoon, a few reds to take the edge off the speed, and then to the bar. At the bar, the Madonna in the red mirror. My arm around her waist and the shared look that said, the world is coming apart. Let us hold one another against the great noise of it all. Waking with her the next morning and seeing her older, her 3-year-old wandering in and staring with a little worm of confusion in his forehead. The banner on her bedroom wall that read, acceptance in large block letters. At night, going out to unpack the war from my trunk, a sea bag full of jungle utilities that stank of rice paddy, silt, and blood to remind myself it happened. Lost them somewhere between Tucson and Chicago. Days up on a scaffold working gable-end trim with Mexicans who came through a hole in the fence the night before. Rednecks who paid me better than them. Laughing at jokes that weren't funny to keep the job. At a New Braunfels Oktoberfest, getting in a fight with a Black Army private who wore a button that read, "Kiss me, I'm German." I don't remember what the fight was about. Back in Tucson, up against the patrol car being cuffed for something I don't remember doing. Leaving the state. Back with Jill in San Antonio, finding her in the same bar. Driving her home in her car because she was too drunk. The flashers on behind me, then the flashlight in my face. In those gentle days, they drove you home. Stealing Jill's car out of the impound lot next morning to avoid the fee. Later sitting buck naked across from one another at the breakfast table, wondering who we were. This woman who wanted to live with a man who had dreams so bad he would stay awake for days until the dreams started to bleed through into real time and he had to go back the other way into sleep to escape them. Who woke with the shakes before dawn and went to the kitchen for beer. Later walking down to the barrio slowly without talking, our hips touching. The Mexican restaurant, a pink adobe strung with chili pepper Christmas lights the year round. Inside, the bullfight calendar with a matador's corpse laid out on a slab, naked and blue, with a red cloth across his loins and the inevitable grieving virgin kneeling at his side. The wound in the same place the centurion euthanized Christ with his spear. Our laughing, then not laughing, because laughter and grief are born joined at the hip. An old Mexican woman fanning herself at the cash register, her wattles trembling. Recordar, to remember, to pass again through the heart. Corazon, coraggio, core. And another poem from a much younger man, Blues. Love won't behave. I've tried all my life to keep it chained up, especially after I gave up pleading. I don't mean the woman, but the love itself. Truth is, I don't know where it comes from, why it comes, or where it goes. It either leaves me feeling the knife of my first breath or hangdog and sick at someone else's unstoppable, and as the blues song says, can't sit down, stand up, lay down, pain. Right now, I want it. I'm like a country who can't remember the last war. Well, that's not strictly true. It's just been too long, and my heart is like a house for sale in a lot full of high weeds. I want to go down to New Orleans and find the Santeria woman who will light a whole table full of candles and moan things. Place a cigar and a shot of whiskey in front of Chongo's picture and kiss the blue dead Jesus on the wall. I want something. Used to be I'd get a bottle and drink until the lights went out, but now I carry my pain around everywhere I go because I'm afraid I might put it down somewhere and lose it. I've grown tender about my mileage. My teeth are like Stonehenge, and my tongue is like an old druid fallen in a ditch. A soul is like a shrimper's net they never haul up, and it's full of everything. A tire, a shark, an old harpoon, a kid's plastic bucket, an empty half pint, a broken guitar string, a pair of ballerina shoes with the ribbons tangled in an anchor chain, and the net gets heavier until the boat starts to go down with it, and you say, God, what is going on? In this condition, I say love is a good thing. I'm ready to capsize. I can't even see the shoreline. I haven't seen a seagull in 3 days. I'm ready to drink salt water, go overboard, and start swimming. Suffice it to say, I want to get in the bathtub with a Santeria woman and steam myself pure again. The priest that blesses the water may be bored, hungover. He may not even bless it. Just tell people he did. It doesn't matter. What the Santeria woman puts on it with her mind makes it like a holy mirror. You can float a shrimp boat on it. The spark that jumps between her mind and the priest's empty act is what makes the whole thing light up like an oil slick on fire against a sunset over Oaxaca. So if I just step out into it, if I just step off the high dive over a pool that may or may not have water in it, that act is enough to connect the two poles of something and make a long blue arc. I don't have a clue about any of this. Come on over here and love me. I used to say that drunk. Now I'm stark raving sober, and I say, come on over here and love me. Jules lived to be 94 years old, which is extraordinary. I'm in the last year of my 8th decade, and I hope to match him. Not guaranteed, I realize. When he was 11 years old, Hitler invaded Poland. He was 22 in 1950 when he joined the NAACP. He seems not to have rested, not taken a breath. His writing and editing is extraordinary. His long life started me thinking about what it means to live a long time. I may not live as long as Jules, but I'm in the last year of my 8th decade. What does it mean to have been born in the middle of World War II? What does it mean to have gone to Vietnam and then joined the anti-war movement on my return? What does it mean to have seen 2 civil rights acts, women's reproductive rights and gay rights, become settled law? And what does it mean to watch these great accomplishments being dismantled by an extreme right? What does it mean to grow an eye in the heart, to grow toward compassion? What does it mean to live in this body now failing, but which nevertheless is a geography of those decades, its cells full of memory? I'm going to read 3 poems from a new book. All over town, I am aware that at this hour, in houses and apartments all around me, people are stepping into their showers. I make the water hotter as I grow used to it, steam rising around me, soothing me, clearing my nostrils. I reach for the soap and lather myself, wash my scant hair behind my ears, remembering my grandmother long ago scrubbing me as if I were a burnt pot. But I am gentle now, knowing the hurt places I've gathered. I tune myself to a lover's hands, remember the last woman who was good at it. All over town, people are being tender with themselves in this hour between waking and dressing, before putting on the gang face to go to work, chasing away whatever wisps of dreams might be hanging on. I feel for scars above my eyebrows from fighting, the ridge of my twice broken nose, the side of my face where they dug out the big chunk of cancer, and the long suture marks on my neck where they took the graft to plug it. My throat, a broken cathedral organ of backed up love. My ailing left shoulder, my once proud chest, moving on down to the love handles, to the gut beneath which hide the ribbed muscles, the fading burns on my hands, the pitted flesh from the bullet fragments, now mostly covered with tattoo, my shop-worn cock, and my balls hanging all day in the dark by themselves, scheming. My disintegrating right knee, torn ligaments of the other leg, down toward the feet, almost crushed now under the weight of a life. For a moment at this hour, perhaps we are all this way. It makes me sad that we are alone in this holy of holies, grieving the failing flesh beneath which death sits in her carriage, loosely holding the reins. Wings. Been so long since I've been loved, even touched, I told her, with no self-pity in my voice, just fact. And she reached over and took my hand in both of hers and felt deftly its several bones and worn gristle that held them in place, as if she were holding a bird that hit a glass door to feel it come back to life in her hands. Michael Thelwell talked about the Tet Offensive of 1968. I was in it. As a clueless young man, as a corpsman in a Marine rifle company. The other part of this poem, this is Tet 1968, 2015 of Valentine. The other part of this poem is 35 draft horses I worked with for about 5 years. Only my unconscious knows why they're in the same poem. Tet 1968, 2015 of Valentine. Clouds heaped 3 tiers high on the horizon. Lightning whitens the chambers tier by tier all the way up. And again, thunder like arc light, bombing, and more flashes. They're coming, the colonel said. If you get a heavy concentration of mortars on target or not, they're coming. Arc light along the ridge. There, 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 there. And seconds later, the rumble with its hooves clattering toward me through the trees. Safeties clicked off like a chatter of cicadas. They're coming. Hear their hoof beats. See the silhouettes of their helmets beneath the camouflage. Flash and crunch. Walking them in on us. Flash, shrapnel skittering through the trees, brings down leaves. But now they lean their long faces over the fence. I unhook the gate and go in. They come toward me one by one. I rub them just below the mane, and Merlin, the whole big myth reel of him, grabs my pocket flap with his teeth as if it were a tangled clump of brush that must come off. He grooms me like one of his own. This is love. They are coming, the thunder of them, the soft eye big enough to free fall into all the way to the gods. The ears straight up in listening, better than any human listening. I wander among them and greet them one by one, 32 of them. When they run, thunder like arc light, thunder like myth. The clouds lit tier by tier all the way up, flash and flash again, and the rain fragrant in the earth. They are coming, and they are full of love and enchantment. The war that is happening always, everywhere, stops. Their heartbeats like arc light, sending, 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 the slow pulse of them, the knowing. Thank you.
So I realized I actually should have asked you more questions, Jim. Thank you so much for inviting me. Listening to all of you, it's really been an honor to hear you, and it's also resulted in my shifting gears a little bit and to thinking about what I'd like to say to you. Jim said talk a little bit about your work, and I do actually see, hearing all of you, many different resonances with my thinking about my work, and I'll just get right into it. Dress British, think Yiddish, right? And then there's the other one, another that wasn't said today, but someone said, be a Protestant in public and a Jew in the home. And I think on some level, those statements I grew up, sort of hearing. I won't say it right away, but I'll get into it. So there is some overlapping here, resonances. So some years back, an esteemed professor whose seminar I adored brought me into his office to talk about my writing, from which he had gathered I was not a native English speaker. In fact, I am a native English speaker, but I felt obliged to imagine a justification for his query. I have inherited a less than perfect attachment to English idiomatic expressions, and, in all likelihood, a few watered-down Germanic constructions that mutated into something else when they came into contact with my mostly elected affinities in Spanish. And I say mostly elected in part because Spanish was quite familiar to me, although my parents didn't speak Spanish. My grandfather spoke it fluently as someone who was a refugee from Austria, and I have a speech from him in which he speaks to Bridgeport community of Spanish speakers in Spanish and saying he was much closer to Spanish than he was to English. I also have family who escaped into Spanish-speaking countries, and so that's where the mostly elected affinities comes into being. These characteristics can put me into an awkward position when it comes to translating, since on occasion I can be delayed to notice when foreign constructions are not entirely intelligible in English. However, more importantly, I appreciate the discomfort inspired by unusual constructions, taking grammar and style to be a mirror into individuals and the context which they reside and express themselves. So here we're going to get into what I was thinking for today. So I'm going to talk to you about my translation project of an essay by Jorge Mañach called Indagación del Choteo, Inquiry into Choteo, and I'm also going to talk about my more recent work that is in some way a translation project, and it's thinking about politeness. It's thinking about refinement, lo fino, la finura, y la fineza in the Cuban context, and it's a translation project which takes the form of documentary. So I'll begin. To this day, nearly 100 years ago, after an inquiry into a unique brand of Cuban humor was delivered as a speech at Instituto Hispano-Cubano de Cultura in Havana, many are those who speak of choteo as an essential form. No longer are critiques of essentialism what they once were in the face of a political field where both abject passions and efforts to ameliorate century-old injustices rely on them. But the opposition between sobriety and humor and us and them continues to inform how Cubans on the island and in the diaspora face political problems nationally and internationally. I translated an inquiry into choteo not just for other readers, but for myself, as an exercise to attempt to get to the core of one of those essays that is so often quoted and rarely studied as a whole. I believe in the importance of returning to the mixed feelings toward Cuban people's relationship to sobriety and humor, garnered in Jorge Mañach's essay as a way to more deeply understand not just current problematics in Cuba among intellectuals, artists, and the government, and Cubans' diasporic socio-political positioning within the United States, but also to better apprehend my own role as a translator of peoples whose governments have historically been in opposition to one another. In her article, Performing Translation, Sandra Berman reviews how Judith Butler underscores, quote unquote, the interruptions of selfhood and the role of alterity intrinsic to the process of translation, while gesturing toward her own developing conception of ethics, end of quote. Berman goes on to discuss the topic of translation as an allegory for the way hegemonic traditions and integral subjectivities can be transformed through encounters with otherness, end of quote. The documentary project that I conceived and am co-directing with Juan Carlos Alom is entitled Phenotype, and I see it as acting as another step toward the comprehension of more than the ideological and historical differences between Cubans and US Americans, of the way that attitudes cross borders, get translated and mistranslated. It examines the performance of the fino across generations and sociological groups on the island and in the diaspora, revealing undercurrents of the Republic, the Cuban Republic, the First Republic, as they affect people's identities and relationships to others and their worldviews in the present day. I see it as an audiovisual interlinguistic translation project, translating from Spanish to English, not just through subtitles, but through questions that seek to locate local explanations of seemingly universal affective tensions. And it's interlinguistic in that it seeks for spectators to locate themselves in the relationality among the different signifiers linked to choteo, that fear of being mocked for standing out as exceptional from the crowd. We might recall one of Mañach's admonitions. He said, choteo has tended to instill in our people the fear of noble forms of distinction, the fear of being too intellectual, too spiritual, too courteous, and even too sensible or elegant. I realize I just have been reading from the wrong text, but it's great. I went back. That's good. Here we go. Let's see where we are here. It is difficult to reckon with, and that's exactly where I picked it up. So it's difficult to reckon with how, on the one hand, Cubans are frequently accused of exceptionalism. On the other, the fear of standing out, putting oneself out there to be mocked, is also identified as a Cuban trait by Mañach. That said, I see the tense relationship toward distinction attributed by Mañach as a result of a culture infused in choteo as one of the Republican antecedents of my investigation to the Fino, where I address the transforming significations of the Fino, Finura, and Finesa for Cubans on the island and in the diaspora. Why return not just with a translation, but also with an addendum, the proposal of another category that similarly may seem essentialist at first sight, only to break it down and render its reliance on other categories that evoke a feelings towards one's own place in the world and what of those of others who surround them. Let us briefly look into an encounter between Cubans and US Americans through the media representation and self-representation of Enrique Tarrio, referred to as Afro-Cuban by the US media, a term that already entails a translation. Enrique, born Henry, was raised by Cuban parents who immigrated with their own parents as children in the early 70s. Having once pleaded guilty to fraud, Tarrio is also the quintessential choteador, who brings together two crucial meanings of the term. You know Enrique Tarrio of the Proud Boys, right? As a prolific cooperator, Tarrio is a practitioner not just of snitching, which is one of the significances, the meanings of the word, but also of roasting. If you remember the Proud Boys, they said, "We are a drinking club with a patriot problem." Tarrio has also repeatedly said he was raised in La Havana in Miami and was lured to the Proud Boys because it was a similar atmosphere to the home where he grew up. He has been quoted frequently as saying, quote, "My house at like 7 o'clock in the morning, there's like 20 people in my house talking about politics, roasting each other, just making fun of each other. I was brought up in that environment, so that kind of brings me into the fuckery that comes with being a Proud Boy. We're not an angry bunch. It's actually a celebration of the West, is what we consider. We want to celebrate what our founding fathers have built, but before anything, we want to celebrate it." On the most literal level, roasting can be translated into Spanish as choteo, or perhaps tirarlo todo a relajo, or to use a more contemporary phrase that Mañach doesn't mention, darle cuero. Tirarlo a relajo, or tirar a relajo, as Mañach referred to it, means to make fun of everything. But that translation back into Spanish also entails a distance from power and a direct, discrete desire for it. To comprehend that relationship to power, and I should say that there's a lot of terms I leave in Spanish. So thinking about earlier presentations, tirarlo a relajo is one of them. To comprehend that relationship to power, Cristina Beltran took Tarrio as evidence of multicultural whiteness. Quote, "The promise that they too can lay claim to the politics of aggression, exclusion, and domination." End of quote. In order to gain further insight into these explanations, it's necessary to translate into the US-American context the broad significance of these sometimes problematic identifications in the Cuban-American context. In so doing, let us recall Enrique de Risco's interpretation of Mañach's essay as an exploration of Cubans' discomfort with their own being, as a very post-colonial sort of state. The latter interpretation leads to his analogy between Cecilia Valdés, you might know is the sort of very canonical 19th century work by Cecilia Villaverde, Passing as White, and national identifications with Europe and the USA in the years after independence. With his intention toward more contemporary times and Cubans in the US, Albert Laguna describes choteo as a popular and quotidian strategy for narrating Cuban national identity, noting how its racial and sexual preoccupations surface in the exile context to do similar work. Furthermore, he speaks of the act of leveling that choteo realizes. And there's this other term that is very significant here, which is parejería. Do you know what parejería means? Parejería, not pajarería, but parejería, is another term upon which I reflected and decided not to translate, is what occurs when a privileged individual deems another to be subordinate and stepping out of their class and caste, behaving in a manner that doesn't correspond to their place in the world. You could think of some translations into English, but it would sort of take away many of those Caribbean associations. Emily McGuire, in her discussion of the racial implications of choteo, also compares its power to that of signifying. She explains that, quote, "What emerges in the act of intertextual signifying is a strategy that fashions a literary community of text through an appeal to cultural communities and shared modes of both oral and written communication. This, quote, end of quote, this movement addresses the way in which bonding around such rhetorical devices permeates political identities on the global level, and why exploring them within a discussion of translation of Cuban text from the Republic that influenced the present day is so crucial. One way to address Tarrio is to think of his actions alongside those of racial shifters in the US. I think we've probably forgotten, right, these exploitative interlopers, Dolezal, right, and Jess Krug, among many others. Tarrio did not seek to pass, but his desire to claim lens on the politics of aggression, exclusion, whiteness embodies, relates to a distaste for political correctness and its imposition on Cuban subjects as it pertains to broader, more historical questions of comportment and conduct. Those, I can suggest, can be traced back to issues that Madach tackles and are brought to the further light in the integration of the meaning of the fino. What is finura? And I'm not going to read anymore, just talking about this translation of the category of refinement, which I use in a very, refinement isn't what the fino is, it's not what finura is, it's not what finesa is. It's one, and so I'm asking Cubans on the island and the diaspora what it means to them. It's a way of telling the story of the legacies of the Republic and how those legacies get sort of intertwined and appropriated by the revolutionary state and then assimilated and played out in everyday lives. And I do actually see a connection to many things that we're thinking about today. Hope you do too. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. My dad was a baseball player, and I think he would call me like the cleanup hitter here. At the end of the day, last one. Hopefully, I will do a good job and keep you guys going a little longer. I'm really, really excited to be here and honored to be back at UMass. I got my MFA here, graduated with Hilary in 2011, I live in the middle of nowhere out in the West, and it is very energizing to be in your presence and to hear all of you and remember what it felt like for me to be here, both in the English sort of department. Of course, MFA is different, but also I worked in the labor union for the grad students for 2.5 years while I was here. I came to UMass as one of the unfortunate grad students who did not have a TA, and I was in the middle of a divorce. I had no money, and I had to get a job on this campus if I was going to be able to stay. And this job of grievance coordinator came up at GEO, which sounded like a lawyer job to me, and I had lawyer training, and I had been kind of a dogged environmental pain in the ass in Alaska. A lot of kind of constant fighting up there on a community level. And so, of course, if there's a GEO job that's available, you have to be a union member to get it, and I wasn't. And I went in there to the little GEO office downstairs in the campus center, and I just said, here's my resume. Are you guys gonna take this seriously or not, given this rule? And they're like, well, we'll look at it. And I told them, and this is for any young people who are left, this is how you get a job, is you say, there is no one on campus who's better at this job than me, so you should give it to me, and they did. And so I was the grievance coordinator for 2,300 graduate students on a campus, as I've been living in Alaska, didn't know anything about what this campus was, but I did know that a lot of these young people, because they're all much younger than me, a lot of them had, thanks to George Bush, and you know the story, were here in the United States dependent on the relationship with their professor. And so there was some terrible, terrible stuff going on this campus. I remember one biology student from Eastern Europe who was supposed to be collecting ticks for the professor, and they were supposed to work so many hours a day and collect so many Lyme ticks, and they were 8 times as many. And this was the kind of thing that I was doing while I wasn't writing short stories over in the English department. And of course, my colleagues at GEO were Marxist anthropologists, political science people who were, I've been living truly in the sticks of Alaska with right-wing America, which is where I've spent most of my time in my adult life for reasons we could get into, but we'll see. You know, they would explain to me, well, Robin, you are obviously an anarchist. Well, oh, I am? What? How do you know that? And they would explain why I was an anarchist. So that's how I got here, and my time at Geo, in the world of Jules, I know that I'd never met him, but I was obviously in his aura, was a profoundly important time for me. It was a really hard time too. You know, writing stories when you're not sure how that's gonna go is scary. It's a very scary time. So anyway, that's how I got here. I'm fortunate enough to have wonderful teachers here. I had a novel come out last year called Pity the Beast that was called A Western, a Feminist Western, an Eco-Feminist Western, and a Product of a Deranged Mind by your friend, Sabina Murray. And then I've got a collection coming out, and I'm gonna read a little bit from it, called Get 'em Young, Treat 'em Tough, Tell 'em Nothing, and it has been called brutal, hilarious, feral, fantastical, fire hose of the burning world, merciless, tender, ornate, uniting the personal and the political, and like watching a film half drunk, which is my favorite, maybe, of those. One of the things that one of my professors here at UMass said is that you should try to put what you believe in your stories. And that is pretty hard, because what you believe in is often not personal. It's usually sometimes something about the world, about what I worried about in Alaska, what I worried about here at UMass when there was a lot of racism that I saw, there was a lot of oppression that I saw, there was a lot of sexism. And then since I've left UMass, I went back out into the hinterlands because I wanted to try to engage with the hinterlands. And I love the United States, and I have big, big problems with this country. So I write a lot about evil. I write a lot about terrible things. Pretty much always I write about the terrible things people do, and it gets me into a lot of trouble in my life. My dad, who's a neurologist, one time told me that maybe I write the way I do because I had brain damage when I was a child. I'm like, thanks, Dad. So I'm just gonna read from a little bit from the first story in this collection, which is called But for Herr Hitler, and it has a wonderful character in it, an aunt, that I'm not going to read from, but it's a story of a family that moves to Alaska, sort of a cheerful, not cheerful, the husband of the family is a veteran of the Iraq War, and he had lost his arm, and they're kind of optimistic, adventuresome couple, but she gets very, very ill, and their life basically starts to fall apart while they deal with it. He basically gets radicalized to what we would maybe think of as a militia person now. So this got some hard stuff in it. Hopefully it will make sense to you. The next winter, Eric, who's the husband, attended a men's meeting in North Pole at the middle school, put on by the affiliate of the VFW. Sometimes he was gone all night. The men held hands in circles. The chairs were plastic, round tables with pads of paper and pens in 4 colors. He was familiar, he told them, with casualties of all kinds, by bullet or tripwire, a knife in the back, friendly fire, landmine, IEDs, under the tire, rubber as weapon. He read all the literature on death, pain, and phantom limbs. The men nodded. Some wore ill-fitting uniforms. Some were thin and limped. They agreed war casualties seemed accidental, indiscriminate, that specific intent was lacking in war. She was tall at first, a willow, he told them. His love for her could not be described. When a man said, "I know the feeling," Eric wanted to crack his teeth. "She's become strange," Eric said, "lavish." The men murmured. He told them about Seattle, the mother, the checkbook, envelopes with $20 bills. "Spoiled," one of them said. The men shifted positions in their chairs. They talked about the hippie camp down at the creek, Reiki and drumming circles, Irish smelling of liquor and weed. Some are predisposed to suffering, they agreed in general. Some give into it. Sickness is a form of tyranny, they nodded. Some people can't stick with name, rank, and serial number. Most people are cowards. Right. Think of the gas chambers, they said. The Nazis, those Jews walked right in. What kind of people would walk right in? Sheep. Hitler got a few things right, they said. Eric shook his head as if waking up. "Wait a minute," some said. "Humans are sons of bitches," Eric said, and they agreed heartily. "Man, let's think bigger. Let's try to understand this. Assassinations are cleansing." Jefferson said revolution every 10 years. They discussed ambush and sacrifice and the most expensive targets, the pipeline, the Valdez terminal, the Space Needle. "Talk, talk, talk," Eric said. He showed them his missing hand, told them how he'd bled out in a slow puddle from a stretcher to an airlift, to the Gulf, to sickbay in Frankfurt, then undergone sequential truncations to the elbow. They went around the circle showing scars. They wrote, "What's needed is conviction.